And we're going to have Dr. Carl Hill excuse me, everyone, we're going to get started. And Dr. Carl Hill is going to moderate the next section. So, Carl?
All right, thanks, John, and good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right, hope you had an enjoyable and delicious lunch. We'll turn to a discussion about institutional improvements for ADRD research, and Dr. Stephen Thomas, who is Professor of Health Services Administration and Director of the Maryland Center for Health Equity and co-director of the MPH Health Equity track there at the University of Maryland. And he will be discussing building bridges, building trust, building healthy communities, advancing African American participation in research. So Dr. Thomas, can we bring you down? Hey man, how you doing? Good to see you. Good to see you. All right, Dr. Thomas, thank you.
So good afternoon. As you can see, I'm faced with the after lunch challenge. And before they start turning the clock on me as people are gathering in, I just want to say that I'm really honored and pleased to have been invited here to this meeting. It's really my first time in this community of Alzheimer's researchers. And I hope that the question I asked and the spark that it started doesn't mean I won't be invited back. But actually, it is that moment for me that let me know this was actually real, that you were actually truly interested in engaging the controversial issues around race and research recruitment. And I've been in rooms like this where that topic is on the table and everyone talks around it. So the fact that we could have a non-sanitized conversation, that we could agree and not be disagreeable, that we could kind of crack open the box of race and research at a time in our country where these themes are being almost screamed at, okay? And so if there's ever a way for us to come back together as one nation, in my opinion, it is in this arena of health. It is in this arena of saving lives and improving the quality of life for everyone. So I would just want to commend you. Commend you for being part of that conversation and showing the rest of the country how we can come together. These are controversial issues. These are my disclosures, and I guess my time is ticking. So I use this image. It was produced by one of our undergraduate students during the 50-year anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement, and I've used it ever since. And my friend, the entering freshman class, they were born in 2000. The year 2000, right? Some of them don't know who this is. Our students who come from all over the world, they didn't grow up in America, they didn't grow up in our history, they don't know who this is. We cannot forget how we have gotten where we are. So embrace our history. It will take us to the next level. So building bridges, building trust, building healthy communities is the core theme of our Center for Health Equity at the University of Maryland. And I may say some things that you don't agree with, and so here's all the contact information. Let's keep the conversation going. So this is my crew. In fact, we were at the University of Pittsburgh for a decade before we were recruited to University of Maryland, and my entire research team was recruited to Maryland. So we were the largest cluster hire in the history of the university. The two other African-American men and the young Latino woman on the far left have all since been promoted and tenured. Give them a hand, will you? So Dr. Quinn and I, as a senior faculty, have created the kind of infrastructure that allows junior faculty to do the work in the community and become promoted and tenured. Many of them have been told, if you work in the community, you'll never be promoted. And I think that responsibility falls back on us as institutions to make sure that that community infrastructure is already in place. So I use the word architect purposely. We need to draw from other fields to understand how to move forward. It is not simply going to be an answer coming from our clinical colleagues. We have to draw on other disciplines. And so I'm going to try to touch on each of these images that you see on this screen, and we'll see how far we get. Okay, so building trust. We were the recipients of an NIH National Bioethics Infrastructure Research Award several years ago, and one of our scientific products is an online interactive website for training investigators and bringing the issue of research to the community. I would encourage you just to Google UMD Building Trust and to explore the site and give it a test drive. We also have launched a summer institute on becoming a self-reflective researcher. One of the colleagues said something about humility and cultural competence versus cultural, we don't think you can get online like a city training and do your cultural competence bubble forms, okay? This is a lifelong process of becoming a self-reflective researcher. We call it cultural confidence. Cultural confidence. And I believe that there may be a few people in this room who actually attended our first inaugural training this summer on the University of Maryland campus. And this is the inaugural class. I think I see here the Maya Angelou director in this photo. And I show this because we're standing in front of a statue of Frederick Douglass. Now, when I tell colleagues that there's a statue of Frederick Douglass on my campus, they think I'm at a historically black college. But the history of why this is on our campus is the history of the University of Maryland's struggle to freedom from its own racism, okay? So we need to help our institutions move through the past by not forgetting it and leave the markers along the way for that next generation. And so I've taken all my epi and incidence and prevalence slides out because I think that the gist of the issue for us is about social context, the social context of health disparities. And that our real challenge is to move beyond the biomedical model and really demonstrate to the community that we are interested in and concerned about addressing issues of poverty, elimination of environmental hazards in homes and neighborhoods, and implementing effective prevention programs that are actually tailored to the community. This is more than taking a brochure and putting it in Spanish, or putting a brown face on a brochure that had a white face on it. It is redesigning, reimagining from the perspective of the community. And it is here that I'm hoping we can agree on definitions. I've been in rooms like this where the whole meeting is on definitions. We're academics, we do that, and the community does not have that kind of patience. So I'm hoping that we can agree, and that this administration has not changed the website, of what it means when we say disparity. A disparity is a particular type of difference. We saw a lot of statistics up here today, but it is those differences that we can say are linked directly to social, economic, and environmental disadvantage. A disparity is caused by oppression. It's not simply a difference in incidence and prevalence. So when you're in a room and people are putting up those kind of slides and they disentangle them, if you don't point this out, then it is a logical step to say, well, what's wrong with those people? This is what my students who are in the epi class say. Dr. Thomas, they had the whole discussion on sexually transmitted disease and I was hiding under the table. I said, why? It didn't affect you. But every single data point had black people off the chart. And the instructor never said anything about the context in which these things happen. That applies to many other diseases as well. So if you don't put that context on it, it's what's wrong with them. And then let's not forget our challenge to bring equity, the highest level of health for all people. And the evidence would suggest that where you have large inequalities, income inequalities, large disparities, everybody suffers. Even the most advantaged people suffer. So it's in that context that I do believe history matters. And while we may not all be able to go back and get an undergraduate degree in African American history, we put a 1-minute slide deck together that will take you from the middle, the crossing from Africa during the time of slavery to the election of Barack Obama. I'm just going to have you Google Civil War, Civil Rights, and you can look at that yourself. But it is I'm already, you probably started when I was in the commercial phase. Okay, so now I'm rushing to the finish line. If you want to know how to recruit, what cultural tailoring looks like, you must study the Tuskegee study. Do you know what it takes to keep a cohort together for 40 years? Not easy. And so understanding what they did is very, very important. Because it is associated with such an atrocity, should not close our eyes to what was done and what unintended consequences can happen when we don't pay attention. So yes, hiring minority outreach workers, very important, but none of those workers want to be standing there like Eunice Rivers was in 1972 when she read the paper about the Tuskegee study. She was a nurse that kept those men together for 40 years. She did not leave that town. She was treated like a traitor, okay? So nobody wants to feel that way. Folk know how to open up the doors to their community. They know how to build trust, but we also must be trustworthy. Who's coming in behind us? Who might use that data in ways that are not respectful? That's your job too. So this cultural memory is real. And while they may not cite line and verse of the Tuskegee study, there is an oral tradition that they know something bad happened when people showed up in white coats and said, "I'm here to help you." So we've published our work. Here you'll see the influence of race ethnicity on becoming a human subject. We have the symbolic value and limitations of racial concordance. Race matching is important, but it is not sufficient. And white investigators can do an excellent job. And in this study, we describe a guy who was called White Mike. That was the nickname that the black community gave him. And when he got that nickname, White Mike knew he was okay. He knew he was in. White Mike was cool. And so we would like for you to think about where you are in your Alzheimer's research in the context of this continuum of disparities research. First generation disparities research documents the existence of the disparity. I've seen that data presented here today in Alzheimer's. Second generation disparities research explains, it's because of all the different things we heard from the previous presenters. That's second generation. Third generation disparities research are the solutions. These are the randomized clinical trials that prove that there's something that might work. Unfortunately, third generation disparities research lives in our journals and sometimes never makes it out to actual practice. We've called for fourth generation disparities research, building on all those blocks to really take action in recognizing the social determinants and recognizing race, not as variables to explain away, but as variables to actually include up front. And then we look for wicked problems. What's a wicked problem? Here's our definition of wicked problems, because it's in these wicked problems that you're going to find the vulnerable populations that have not come into your healthcare system yet, but they're poised to come into your healthcare system. The whole point is to get out in front of this, get out of the offices, out of the clinic, into the neighborhoods. And so when you have problems like this, incomplete or contradictory information, multiple opinions, the political people don't want to look at it because it's too expensive. That's a wicked problem. And we found such a problem, and here's what it looks like on the ground. One of our interventions took place in the city of Pittsburgh, and I know we have people here from Pitt. And we had cameras rolling at the time, And I wanted, and I want you to see how her story resonates with what we think the future should be. I'm going to ask my friend behind the screen, Mr. Wizard of Oz, hit the button, will you? You can bring the volume up just a bit.
Right now I'm in the toning, and I'm in the African dance, and I'm in the yoga. And I just got some good news, praise God, that I went to the doctors the other day, and I have high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes and cholesterol and things like that is going on within me. So the doctor told me, he pricked my finger, and he said, Miss Hicks, I have some good news. I said, oh, okay. So he says, you know, your level of type 2 diabetes and went down. I said, oh, praise God. And he said, well, I'm going to send you the other results to your home. I said, okay. So I got the results day before yesterday, and I'm just so overwhelmed. My kidney function is back to normal. Praise God, oh Lord Jesus. And I was just so I was just so overwhelmed, praise God, that, you know, you hear so many people say that type 2 diabetes progress, you know, to insulin. And I didn't want to be fearful. I did not want to be scared. And I said, Lord, you know everything, you made everything, and you made me. And I know you can do anything but fail.
Let's give Ms. Hicks a hand, will you? Meet people where they are. Yeah, we did physical activity, but they did African dance. They loved it. We had over 8,000 people in this initiative, and in that pool of 8,000 people, that's that autoplay, my brother. You got to stop that autoplay. We were able to embed other research studies, other clinical trials, so we met the people where they were. We gave them something they needed. We built that trust, and then we embedded research projects. Now you got to bring me back up on screen, Mr. Wizard. So I love the presenter on the narratives. This is another way in which we gather the narratives, by using videography and capturing their stories and packaging them in respectful ways. The other big wicked problem we discovered was oral health care. Are we into oral health? We're into whatever is affecting our community. They've got all these things. They've got dental problems. They've got cardiovascular disease. They've got risk for cancer. You can't silo their bodies. And so in this initiative called the Mission of Mercy, we turned our basketball arena into an emergency dental clinic with 125 dental chairs. It went from cleanings to oral surgery. I want you to see this line here because the first person in line was in line, the doors open at 7 in the morning. The first person was in line at 7 p.m. the night before. These people slept outside overnight, thousands of them. This picture was taken because it was enough light to take the photo. But that line stretched as far as the eye could see. And in the arena, as you can see here, that we transformed, again, an example, we do not need to be in a hospital. We do not need to be in a clinic. We can create environments that bring people into spaces. 120 stations, 1,400 volunteers, 1,100 people served. We turned away 1,000 people, okay? $1.5 million worth of dental care provided. The people who showed up came from all over the region. We geocoded them. These are the other services for the interprofessional education. While people were waiting for their number to be called for the dental chair, they saw physicians, nurses, nutritionists. They signed up for research projects. They could have gotten a cognitive screen maybe. I don't know exactly the settings you need to do your work, but my point is your population is here. And as you can see, the other kind of research, I'm going fairly quickly, and again, publishing the results. And look at that, approximately 66% of the 1,000 plus people that we served had one or more risk factors for chronic disease. And those risk factors were positively associated with an invasive procedure like an extraction. So dentists are seeing early signs of some of the things you see, but you guys aren't talking to one another. So these are ways in which we can come together. Now they really have told me I'm done. So I'm going to close with this because this is the take-home message. Programs like Take a Loved One to the Doctor, great idea, but we didn't have patients who had doctors. Guess what? We took the patients, doctors to the people. And in this one scene here, you can see the logic of it all. And my black friends in here, you need to look to one of your white friends and tell them, no self-respecting black barber will say, I'll get you in and out in 15 minutes. All right? You're going to be there half a day, don't matter how much hair you have, okay? And so in this setting, these guys are communicating. Their lives would have never crossed were it not for this moment in the barbershop. And now we're launching this national across the nation. Entire families come into these spaces. I was going to take you in here, but I don't have time. But for those who need the evidence, okay, there's been a New England Journal of Medicine article. This stuff really works. I'm not saying for you to run out and go do it. But my point is we need to bring these trusted partners online. And so we're now looking at willingness to participate in genomics research by doing interviews and research in these settings. These are the settings where social norms are set. These are the settings where, hey, it's okay to do something or not to do something. And I think that we want to increase the likelihood that that can happen. And so in closing, I would simply say to you and that we need to, whatever we're learning in the community, we need to take back to our leaders of our institutions. Sitting in the chair there is the president of the University of Maryland, Dr. Wallace Lowe, meeting his neighbors for the first time in the barbershop, so to speak. And so let me just say and close with the conversation, the spark. I think it's really, really important to recognize that we have to have that conversation. The danger is to assume that racism is not relevant to the scientific pursuit of solutions. The danger is to assume that populations will always suffer from premature illness or death because of their culture. The danger is to assume that the elimination of disparities is impossible and health equity unachievable. The opportunity is to recognize that these disparities are an issue of justice because specific groups were subjected to systematic racial discrimination and denied basic benefits. The ethical principle of justice in the Belmont Report means that those who bear the burden of research should not be denied the benefit. The history of medical research has a whole lot of people of color bearing the burden. We now need to benefit. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Thomas. Always informative and fun. Been listening to Dr. Thomas do his thing for 20 years, so it's been good to be in your company. We'll turn to Dr. Cerise Elliott, who is with the National Institute on Aging and a new program director who will be talking a bit. Talking about advancing institutional recruitment infrastructure for healthy communities. So come on up, Cerise. Thank you.
Okay, exciting. There's lots of all sparkles and sparks going on. I don't have any slides, you're just going to have to listen to my voice, maybe see my hands go up. Basing off what Dr. Thomas has just talked about, I wanted to talk about advancing institutional recruitment infrastructure for healthy communities because the institution has a responsibility to create and innovate new opportunities to go out into the community. And in our institution of the National Institute on Aging, you know, Dr. Hill over here brought, you know, some new blood into the whole health disparity kind of framework within the Institute. And he's been working really hard across the entire field of aging. And he started with the research framework, which Dr. Barnes showed briefly in her slides. And, you know, what the framework did was provide a common language, something for him to pinpoint to everyone when he goes out and speaks to everyone, to gather information and give everyone a guide as to say, you know, these are the informations that are lacking, and these are the things that we need to be focusing on. And I think in life we always need guideposts and things like that. And so with this framework being created, we then were appropriated the funds to do Alzheimer's disease research at a new level. And Dr. Hill and I took that opportunity to have specialized funding for health disparities. And so the last 3 years, we had an open program announcement in which we specifically said, yes, we are the NIA. Yes, we are interested in health disparities. Yes, don't sit behind your desk anymore. Put in an application. We want to review it. We want to give you money. So to know that I had to work really hard to convince people to put in applications because they were so uncertain that reviewers would accept their hypotheses or their approaches, and for me to counsel them and say, no, do it. What you have is great. What you have is, you know, providing additional perspective on a problem that includes things that matter to other people and that are different than just the biological approach of disease. What we need is this multifactorial approach to studying Alzheimer's disease because, you know, we've been studying amyloid and tau for like 30, 40 years, and I think we're kind of like need some new options. We can include those options because everyone kind of agrees that, you know, these are the hallmarks, but I think we need other factors because as we live our lives and we have all different experiences. So from this health disparities kind of focus, at the same time, because again, there's, you know, Alzheimer's, we're a small field, but we're big, and there's multiple partners going on and multiple things happening. And there was a big push, like in 2016, to like, okay, you know, we under-enroll in clinical trials. We need to do something about recruitment and participation. And so, as I mentioned this morning in my welcome remarks, for 2 years, people worked on a national strategy of recruitment and participation in Alzheimer's disease. And again, it's a common language. It's something that's going to be out there for not just NIA, not just for the Alzheimer's Association, but any community board member who wants to look this up and go back to their institution and say, we are interested in participating with you in this way. We want to add to this language, and we want to gather additional information with our own community because we care about Alzheimer's disease. We care about our loved ones, and we want to participate in research. So because the strategy was coming online, we have now this R24 that Dr. Barnes mentioned. It's examining diversity in recruitment and retention and aging research. And I specifically did not make it, you know, specific to Alzheimer's disease. I think, you know, examining diversity and recruitment and retention in the entire institute, in the whole field of aging is important. And what we're doing is giving, again, specialized funding to focus on the science of recruitment and retention. If you were here last night, you know, Dr. Hill brought up the main points that Peggy Dilworth Anderson, started, almost a decade ago, that these are the hallmarks of, recruiting and participating and community engagement. And we're looking, again, to have a whole bunch of teams that we're providing funds for to build a common language and a common goal and a common process that we can, as a team, work to recruit and have diversified research opportunities for all of society. If you're in this room and you're interested, I have a webinar coming in December, December 11th. It's gonna talk about the key features of the R24. We call it like a pre-technical workshop. You could come to me, I can give you my cards, and I'll send you the information that you get the information from. So that's a Tuesday morning, like at 10 a.m. And the 6 kind of themes that this R24 is dealing with is 1, build collaborative teams. We're providing you money to get a whole network of people together to talk about recruitment and retention. We're looking for innovative outreach. We purposely brought people who talked earlier today about their innovative outreach processes. Dr. Croft, lots of work. She built 72 little vignettes that were specific to her population and specifically talked about like a historical moment in the gentrification of Portland. And that was very specific and very treasured with those people who are participating in their studies. What other kind of activities and things that we could do to increase outreach? The next that kind of go in order is the research infrastructure, diverse volunteers, research resources, and enrollment in clinical research. So I'm going to highlight and zero in on this recruitment infrastructure, since this is what we're talking about in this session. And to build on what Dr. Thomas just kind of talked about, in kind of the same ways that I feel about it, is that we need a significant number of committed research participants to aging research, and we have to be able to do this in a way that doesn't depend on my agency to give you money. We need, as a field, to obtain resources in addition to the ones that are provided by my agency. When you apply to the award, you have to address your institutional support and discuss the commitment beyond the period that I'm paying you to do this. We need to be able to have like your community, you're creating this opportunity that the community is gonna adopt your efforts. Your efforts are so innovative that your community is running to you. They wanna be part of your research infrastructure. They want to be part of the goals, part of the plans, part of the staff. They want to volunteer to do things in your clinic because they're so just empowered and inspired, and they want to be part of your research infrastructure. You want your community to also provide you a significant contribution back. As you're planning research, are all the institutions within your area, involved in your research? Are all the departments in your institutions aware and incorporated into the process? Is the institution working to maximize participation across everything, not just Department of Neurology or the Department of Gerontology? Is there like a knitting and a collaboration to make everyone succeed for the community and the benefit of the health? Are you tapping your developmental offices and like crowing about what you're doing and how they should start fundraising for you? What about your community relations department, your alumni association? Is there sharing from like all departments? And we talked earlier about the professional staffing and workforces to support that support sufficiency and complete the priorities of this initiative. But the goal, is engagement and outreach, education opportunities to incorporate the community into the infrastructure, and that the community becomes part of your recruiting team. So how many of you can, sit here and think, is my community really part of my recruiting team, or am I still kind of talking at them and not with them? So to summarize about recruitment infrastructure, is that, we want to exponentially maximize the contacts that we have by incorporating each engagement into a recruitment opportunity. You want to, start with one person, they told 5 people, those 5 people told 5 people, and all of a sudden you have a lot of community members being involved. Am I saying it's easy? No. As I summarized for the last 15 minutes, I think, this is years of work that I'm summarizing. It's going to take a plan, it's going to take an effort, but, community, your research has to be inclusive and representative with volunteer participants, because homogeneous populations give you homogeneous theories of disease, and only, heterogeneity will give you heterogeneous theories of disease. And so life course habits and experience and resilience affects the science and we should explore those disparities with those things in common and learn from our common languages and goals. So thanks.
Okay, so thanks, Dr. Elliott and Dr. Thomas, for those excellent presentations. We have questions for our presenters.
I want to raise an issue that is more from this morning, but I think I'd love to hear the panel's answers on it, which is a particularly gnarly topic. A lot of the research studies that were shown this morning that have done a good job recruiting African Americans into research, the education level of those African Americans was very high. And so, I know I was talking with Rachel Whitmer yesterday about, and she touched on this during her talk as well, that it's the low education people across race, but in particular, if we're looking at disparities among African Americans, it is very much that if you have a population of people who are with average level 14, 15, 16 years of school, that is just not representative of the population. So I wanted to ask the panel about, in your case, Cerise, interventions or programs that you've seen that are really effective in recruiting African Americans across the education range that are more representative. And in the case at University of Maryland, do you find that which was really inspiring, by the way, the programs that you shared with us, and I think applicable to African American participation in Alzheimer's disease research, do you find that the programs that you're doing are reaching to the African Americans with very few years of education?
So I think it's a good point. In fact, I didn't fully appreciate the significance of it until I actually saw your data. And I think that when you link that up with Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, which is the definitive history of the black migration out of the South, I think we can all learn from that. So you're basically saying that an African American, they're not homogeneous. And we've treated folk that way in all the research studies. We even do the Latinos that way, right? Latinos in Texas are not the same as folks in Puerto Rico. So we're adding layers of complexity. So what we have found in our work, we're in Prince George's County, which is one of the most affluent black municipalities in the country. And yet we are the sickest county in the state, second only to the city of Baltimore, okay? So this notion that higher levels of education with other groups tracks with health. As you get higher levels of education, you get better health. That does not happen with African Americans. That's why Serena Williams' story was so important. Is she not wealthy? Is she not educated? Yet her baby almost died. So making us pay more attention to that variable is important. So our recruitment in the barbershops comes closest to being a natural place where the judge is sitting next to the guy who works on the loading dock at Walmart, who's sitting next to the guy who's homeless. Even the black churches don't have that anymore in that sense. But we have found that in the barbershops and beauty salons, the one business still thriving after integration, that's where people come together. And it's also an echo chamber of word of mouth. They want to know that the person with the, that the judge signed up, or they want to know that they're not being targeted. No one wants to be targeted. So I'm going to pay more attention, and I'd really love to see how that's captured in the various surveys, and to challenge ourselves to recognize the importance of looking across educational attainment.
I think the variability in education is kind of one of those considerations where we as researchers need to make our study design up front. If we understand that our clinic-based population has these certain characteristics, and mostly through time they'll have these characteristics, then other considerations and plans have to be made to diversify that one factor. But again, that's just one factor. And I think, again, the framework kind of brings out the issue that there are multifactorial things, and everyone has a different, every factor also has different levels of being a factor. And that complexity needs to be introduced into this, this examination of this disease, because as more data is being published, we see that you're not seeing an immediate change within the 10 years of death, but it's while I'm 30 years old, I've had some kind of event or some kind of life experience that already defines me when you measure me 30 years later. So it just brings out the complexity of how we should be approaching this disease.
Okay, other questions?
Hi, this is Joyce Ballsbury from Mayo Clinic. I'd like to applaud your efforts. Dr. Thomas, it's good to see you. And my colleague at NIA, congratulations on moving forward that effort with Dr. Hill. So in thinking about what you both presented, and even what some of the other presenters discussed, we know that systematic racism is a issue that plagues us, moving forward. We talked about that yesterday, and as well as been presented today. How can we move forward to have the discussion about how systematic racism impacts stress, impacts economic status, impacts our health as it relates to Alzheimer's disease, while we also acknowledge the historical underpinnings of systematic racism and the impact that it has from the Tuskegee experiment, the Cold War test, and other projects as well on that.
I know for myself, I would welcome more data on those factors, and I welcome all applications that attend to that. I already knew that.
So you know what's interesting? I'm going to tell you how old I am. I'm old we thought we were in a post-racial society. Remember that? That's just a few years ago. We weren't going to talk about any other thing. We were post-racial. And now, with a megaphone, we know very clearly that racism is alive and well. So I think we have to create the space for the conversation. You saw how the little spark today, rippled through this room. We need more time, more safe space, more brave space to have that conversation across all the things that phenotypically make us look different. So the science of racism, in terms of documenting and the instruments are now there. There's a biological framework with stress. So I think it's a very legitimate area of inquiry, but it's spotty. You still might find yourself encountering PIs and others say, what's that have to do with this? Or what's that have to do with that? And that's a conversation that has to happen. And because of this meeting, you brought everyone together in one room around this theme. I think it's an excellent launch point. And the R24 gives an opportunity to see what kind of applications come in, because the project officer is telling you that is eligible. They're interested.
Hi, my name is Alexandria Wise. I'm with Roche Genentech, and I'm just, thank you again so much for your presentation, Dr. Thomas and Dr. Elliott. I'm curious about some of the maybe more unforeseen challenges, pushback from your institutions that you've received that maybe aren't necessarily obvious to all of us in terms of trying to make these changes, trying to set up something like a dentistry program. Was there some things that, perhaps in the planning of it, the institution itself rejected or, said this isn't possible? But, I'm curious what those might be, in addition to, well, why do we care, or we don't have enough funding? I mean, beyond those two kind of general, usual arguments to not do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think within the last 3 years, because of the resources that we've been appropriated, I think myself and my fellow program officers at NIA are really taking the time to look at budgets and say, what do you want to do? And are you really asking the resources that you need? Because, 6 or 7 years ago, people were really conservative and leaving those things out of their budgets. But we're at a time now, if you want to recruit, 500 African Americans, I'm going to look at your budget. I'm going to say, I don't see a recruiter. I don't see a social worker. I don't see any staffing. I don't see any publication costs. I don't see any, printing. I'm looking for, that data of funding to do recruitment and retention, because I feel that we need that data to know what those true budgets are, as opposed to the fake budgets that we got earlier. So if your institution isn't supplying you with the support, and you're looking to us to truly fund you to be successful within 5 years, we are really having those conversations.
So I'll speak to the pushback, and I think that there may be other kind of pushback questions we can address. So, and I know we're being recorded, but I'm going to tell you the truth. If I wasn't a full professor, if I had not been recruited the way I was recruited with all the fanfare, I had to cash in a whole lot of those chips for that moment. Because somebody at a meeting, okay, high-level meeting, said, oh, these missions of mercy, they bring homeless people. So when I heard that, I said, oh, I'm gonna love this. So we're in Prince George's County. Our building casts a shadow on some of the poorest neighborhoods. You're telling me you don't want them on the campus? Let me make sure I understand. I just draw them out. Long story short, 6 months into the planning, somebody tried to pull the plug. We prevailed, and it was so hugely successful. The word what? When's the next one? okay? So there's nothing like success. The fact that we had those young scholars be promoted and tenured, doing research in the community, another evidence of success, because nobody gives away tenure. So I think that that has now built some capital. Do we need gas in the tank that makes this thing keep going? Absolutely, because we did not put those things in a budget. It's not a dental program. It's not siloed. So you're going to have an infrastructure that reaches people with their needs that may not be in the silos of your funding stream. That means institutional investment in community engagement and outreach infrastructure.
And even your Prince George's County should learn about what they're doing at their institutions that they're housing, and there's government and county support that because you've successfully engaged your community, they can go and they write their executive commissioners and say, I got this program and we as a county should support it more. So that's those streams are there. But then also I think, having success, documented success, writing your successes, messaging your plans and your goals and what you've accomplished and how it's better for the institution to buy in on this project is very necessary for any kind of support to be done, because kind of saying it off the cuff is never going to get you the financial needs that you need.
And you know what I really liked about your presentation? You said, I'm going to ask these applicants what their institution's doing, their Office of Development. You said that.
I did.
What's your foundation office relations doing for you? So when those people are going across raising money and fundraising, if you're not on the list, you need to know you're not on the list and get on the list, because your project officer is now going to ask you. NIH now has teeth in what has been a decades-plus long effort of inclusion of women and minorities in research. That's been on the books a long time. Now it has teeth. It has teeth, and people are listening and stepping up. And it has to be more than, we got to hire some minority outreach workers. It has to be authentic. That's what you're hearing today.
Well, let's thank both Dr. Thomas and Dr. Elliott and Dr. Hill. And we're going to move on to the fifth session. It's going to be chaired by Lisa Barnes, and it's going to discuss improvement strategies for African American recruitment.
Okay, let's keep this party going. So this is session 5, improvement strategies for African American recruitment. I'd like to invite Krista Mulder. Dr. Krista Mulder is an associate professor of neurology and the executive director of the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center here at Washington University School of Medicine. She's going to talk to us about scientific directions for the exploration of racial disparities in Alzheimer's disease.
So I just have one slide of introduction because we've been talking about this all day, and certainly everyone here could just speak to this themselves. But just to reframe this, so I think we're all here because relatively little is known about Alzheimer's disease and related disorders in people from all sorts of underrepresented groups. And that we really came about this because we all think of this as a missed opportunity, that this isn't just the way things are, but we're really probably underappreciating factors and mechanisms that may operate differently in Alzheimer's disease in various racial and ethnic groups. That we care about this because this is a community health problem, but we're also probably not understanding the complete biology of the disease. And these are data from NAC, they're not up to the minute exact, but that from our Alzheimer's Disease Centers program, because that's how we couched forming this workshop today, overall, across all of the centers, African Americans comprise only 5.7% of all the participants at our centers program. And it's not just that once we are welcoming and have African Americans come through our doors, but one of the things we also wanted to focus on for this workshop is that once we have active African American participants, overall, they're less likely to engage in all of the studies that we offer. I know we here at the Knight ADRC ask an awful lot of our participants. I'm sure you all do as well. And one example I was just giving here is that from the autopsy program, Only 3.7% of all of the autopsies that are recorded at NAC right now are from African American participants. So I think we're all agreed that this is not where we want to be. So I wanted to take a moment from the great talks that we've had on strategies and best practices to ask a question for a moment. And when I was revisiting my slides, I would like to change the first word there from if to when. So we're going to speculate that we've come up with amazing ideas here yesterday and today, and we have magically done all of the work. And as Cerise said, as Dr. Elliott said, that this is not a question anymore. We don't have to think about diversity and inclusion because that's the norm. So if we had more representation of African Americans in our research and they were fuller participating in all of our research studies, what scientific questions could we ask? So in terms of pathogenesis, pathophysiology, expression of the disease. So as I said, we're going to imagine that we've been a success here and we're 2 years down the road and we can explore all sorts of important questions to all of us. So we were very fortunate then to think about this. We received a grant from the Cure Alzheimer's Foundation, and they were interested in this exact question that I posed on the previous slide. So Dr. Morris and myself, working with Meg Smith from the Cure Alzheimer's Foundation, we came up with some ideas of experts around the country that could help us think about and develop hypotheses that could be tested. So we developed 3 working groups. One was a clinical working group that was chaired by Mary Ganguly and had Lisa Barnes, Helena Chu, Jonathan Jackson, Greg Jica, Oscar Lopez, Jennifer Manley. So many of these people, as you'll see throughout the working groups, are in the audience and speakers today. We had a neuroscience working group, which also included consideration of genetic factors. That was chaired by Alan Levy, included Matthew Blurton Jones, Goldie Bird, Allison Goat, Celeste Karch, Virginia Lee, Richard Mayu, and Betsy Zlakovic. And lastly, a biomarker working group chaired by Tom Montine and included Brian Gordon, William Hugh, Bill Jagus, Keith Josephs, Suzanne Schindler, Julie Snyder, and Les Shaw. We were trying to pick people across a diverse group of individuals, both young individuals, more senior individuals, men, women, across a range of expertise. And when we put together these lists of people, I didn't think we would get everyone to agree. But I think there are 2 important lessons here. One is that people don't like to say no to John Morris. And second is that we all realize what important questions these are. And I think that's why we have a full room here today, too. So we had some teleconferences in June of this year, and then we all met collectively on July 24th in Chicago during the AAIC meeting. Okay, so I'm just going to give you the results. None of the 3 chairs could make it today, unfortunately, so you're stuck with me. But I'm just going to kind of give you some of the scientific ideas that came up from these meetings to sort of, as we go into the breakout sessions, maybe inspire you even more to think why we need to develop important strategies. So the clinical working group came up with a number of topics that they thought were important. And again, this was led by Dr. Mary Ganguly from the University of Pittsburgh. So the first is a question that we've touched upon, a number of speakers and questions throughout yesterday and today. The first is that Alzheimer's disease is a heterogeneous disease, and what does that look like among African Americans? So I think that Dr. Thomas alluded to this in his question earlier today, and just there was a reference to it in the most recent Q&A. What does Alzheimer's disease look like in African Americans? And that again, this was a little bit in these working groups, a little bit of a dream, what we could accomplish. And they were suggesting that we really need population-based longitudinal studies of the prevalence and incidence of Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. And in this perfect world with infinite money, it would begin in midlife. And again, with the idea of heterogeneity of disease among African Americans, it touches upon one of the other concepts that we've had different comments on. So Dr. Jackson, Dr. Hugh alluded to this too, that the idea of having just African American as an umbrella term is not sufficient. We've talked about how individuals with a Caribbean background versus an African background are different. There are probably different factors that come into play in terms of what disease looks like. The other piece I know Dr. Hugh mentioned earlier is how recently have people come to America. If they came to America last year and have an African background, that's going to be very different than someone who came or their family came 200 years ago. The second common thread that the clinical working group developed was defining risk and protective factors. And I've just listed here some of the pieces that they touched on. So one, has come up here, is education, not just amount of education, but also quality of education. I know Dr. Manley had some very nice slides about this. Vascular health, childhood measures, which include family, school, neighborhood, factors like that. There was also a lot of discussion about stress, both overall stress and specific sources of stress, for example, poverty or lifelong discrimination. And there was a big emphasis that this shouldn't just be discussion of stress, but to also include in this study some actual biological measures. So for example, measuring inflammation, measuring DNA methylation, and I believe Dr. Manley also mentioned telomere length. So we can actually capture the data, but also try to get some physiological measures of stress in these individuals. The third point that the clinical group raised was that if we're going to be this successful, we really need to improve clinical trial design. There was a big sentiment that excluding people with vascular disease from clinical trials was misplaced, that it really wasn't going to get you to a representative reflection of disease in people who are ultimately going to be taking that therapy down the road. There was also a big push, as we've discussed here, that you need a community-based strategy in the clinical trials, that just having, if you have even a good representation of African Americans, if all of those have 16 years of education, we're also not being reflective of the overall population. The last piece that the clinical working group said is that we really need to do a better job overall, on maybe a center-wide level, in terms of thinking about norms if we're going to consider African American participants in our studies. So they were really ambitious. They said that we need a national multi-site norming project that would include multiple measures. So cognitive measures, maybe even reconsidering how we stage disease severity, different functional measures, so functional activity questionnaires, and then also biomarkers, as both Dr. Morris and Dr. Hughes' data have shown. Maybe we need to think about different thresholds for tau when we're looking at African Americans. So we need to consider all these different factors across a wide range. So second, the neuroscience working group, which again was led by Dr. Alan Levy from Emory. This working group really split their discussion at the end of it into two strategies. So first, they spent a lot of time talking about unbiased, data-driven approaches. So the example that we used and we came back to in our discussion a lot of time was the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, or AMP-AD. And the idea being that you would take an unbiased, data-driven approach. So we talked a lot about omics. So we had multi-omic profile of human samples. So not just one, but as many of these as that could be done. Whole genome, RNA-seq, epigenomics, proteomics, metabolomics, lipidomics, pick your favorite omics, but to really go across the board and get as much data as possible. And then use systems biology to let the data lead you to what the answers are, to do network analyses to say what functional pathways are being changed across these different measures. So for example, are you seeing changes in inflammatory pathways, changes in synaptic injury, oxidative stress? Those are just examples. And then, which of these pathways show racial dependent changes? A big part of this discussion was that you take existing studies like AMP-AD and you leverage them and you enhance them, you make them better by increasing the representation of underrepresented groups and by just the number of participants and the number of samples that you have. That really we just need to increase the numbers and the diversity that are in these existing projects and will already make the science better. The second strategy that the neuroscience group put forth is to understand, though, that, okay, we're going to use a data-driven approach, but at the same time, we want to have some hypothesis-driven questions. So these were mechanistic approaches, and all of these are just different ideas that got talked about during the discussion. So one was to use induced pluripotent stem cells to examine genetic variants that show racial differences. So for example, in the gene TREM2, there are different variants that show increased risk for African Americans versus non-Hispanic whites. So you could take those stem cells and engineer those mutations, or even take individuals from one race or another that have those variants, and you could see what their biology looks like, and even do gene editing to maybe correct those mutations or change them to the variant from the other racial group and see how the biology changes in those cells. A similar strategy was to build on the Model AD project that's ongoing to create model systems, so mice, that express the racially different genetic variants and look at their biology. There was discussion about maybe looking at targeting. There are several projects, including a collaboration that we're involved in with Betsy Zlakovich's group, looking at blood-brain barrier changes and really trying to increase the number of African Americans in those studies to see what blood-brain barrier changes look like. There was also some discussion about brain development, and there's been some interest recently in the field that maybe how your brain development is even happening in your youth is going to change your risk in later life for dementia or other neurodegenerative diseases. That maybe we need to do a better look at differences across race in development that will educate us on what's happening as we're older. The last sort of hypothesis-driven topic was the idea of genetic pleiotropy. So the idea, if you look at whole genome sequencing, that sort of thing, and you see which variants are coming up in Alzheimer's disease versus other neurodegenerative diseases or vascular disease, are you seeing the same genes come up across the different diseases? And are you seeing the same genes come up across races? The biomarker group, which again was led by Tom Montine, also had two main strategies. They wanted to first define a core set of biomarkers, which would include the conventional Alzheimer biomarkers, amyloid and tau, both in terms of PET and CSF, vascular injury biomarkers, which they defined as MRI measures. We could discuss that in a different forum, but that's what they discussed. And they also talked about having some standard blood-based measures of vascular risk factors, hemoglobin A1C and plasma cholesterol. That the idea would be we would collect these on everyone. But getting back to, I believe, a comment that Dr. Sano made earlier, maybe just the traditional Alzheimer biomarkers aren't sufficient. They don't capture a full range of disease, especially in African Americans. So we should encourage discovery and development of new biomarkers, markers of inflammation, markers of CSF or blood-based measures of brain injury, imaging for perfusion and vascular brain injury, or different sleep studies or actigraphy. And these were just ideas of other things that could be examined. So just some common themes among the three different groups. They had different ideas that you can chew amongst yourselves as the rest of the day goes on. But the first, everyone agreed, was that African American is a heterogeneous designation. And however we move forward, that we need to take that into consideration. The second was almost every group hit upon that we need to be looking at vascular factors, whether those are completely vascular dementia, separate from traditional Alzheimer's disease pathology, or whether it's the presence of amyloid in vessels, or a combination of those things. That it's something that's important that we need to recognize, especially in the African American community, and figure out how we're going to study it. The third point is that perhaps we don't really need to reinvent the wheel to ask these questions. We can build on existing large studies such as AMP-AD, such as All of Us that got mentioned before, or other longitudinal cardiovascular studies, that maybe we can build in components that help our work. The other piece was maybe we do need to reinvent the wheel in certain aspects. Maybe some of our norms, both in terms of biomarkers or cognitive testing or whatever your field may be, that we may need to take a hard look at those and ask if they're really representative and reflective of changes that we can measure in the African American community. So I just wanted to do some acknowledgments here at the end. So I want to thank all of the working group members. They really did. It was great discussions, just like we're having great discussion here. I want to thank Linda Amos for helping organize the meeting in Chicago. I want to thank Dr. Cerise Elliott for her encouragement to pursue this and for also coming to the meeting and helping me take notes. Thank Dr. Morris for pushing this forward and all of his help. And especially Meg Smith for the Cure Alzheimer's Fund for all of her support, also coming to the meeting and helping take notes. And I also wanted to thank Mr. Norman Say, who we honored yesterday at the lecture, because he really pushed us down this road, and we wouldn't be here now, I don't think, without his sage advice. Thanks.
Thank you, Krista. That was wonderful. The next talk has two speakers, so I'm going to introduce them both because I don't know how you're going to do it. So we have Dr. Susie Stark, who's an associate professor of occupational therapy at Washington University School of Medicine, and Dr. Roger Wong, a PhD candidate, I'm sorry, he's not a doctor yet, a PhD candidate at Brown School, Washington University. They're going to talk about recruitment and retention approaches for African Americans in Alzheimer's disease research.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our presentation today is based on a systematic review that we recently completed, and it's currently under peer review. And in that study, I was looking at ways to increase recruitment and retention for all racial minorities in Alzheimer's disease clinical research. But for the purposes of this presentation, I will only present findings from the African American subsample, since that is the focus for this workshop today. So that being said, the title of our presentation is Recruitment and Retention Approaches for African Americans in Alzheimer's Disease Research. How do I go? How do you move forward? Oh, there you go. Sorry. So for my portion of the presentation, I will be presenting findings from 2 research questions in the systematic review. So the first, I wanted to see what were the approaches for recruiting and retaining African Americans in clinical research studies on Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And second, I wanted to see how effective these recruitment and retention approaches were. So as I mentioned, in terms of methods, we did a systematic review. I searched the literature in December 2017, and for each of the 4 phases of the review process shown on the bottom, all the articles were independently assessed by at least 2 reviewers, and any conflicts were resolved from a 3rd reviewer. So for a study to be included in our systematic review, I had to meet 4 inclusion criteria. First, I had to have, of course, African American participants. Second, I had to implement a recruitment or retention approach in Alzheimer's disease or dementia clinical research. And we took the NIH definition for clinical research, which is direct interaction with people, and this is typically to collect biological samples like blood and neuroimaging. Third, the study had to be conducted in the US, and fourth, the study had to be published in English and in a peer-reviewed journal. So as some of you may know, for systematic reviews, you have to create a Prisma flow diagram showing the whole screening process. So if you take a look at the middle here, we started with around 2,600 unique papers, and we ended with about 17 in our final sample that met the 4 inclusion criteria in our last slide. So among those 17 studies that were included in our final sample, these are the study characteristics. So in terms of study purpose, about 71% were on recruitment, and about 29% were on recruitment and retention. So in other words, there were no studies that were strictly on retention. In terms of study design, the most common study design was 1 group pre-test, post-test, and then the remaining second most common was 1 group post-test only. In terms of the sample, the subjects themselves, the average age ranged from about 55 to 77, and the majority of the sample was also female. In terms of the procedures or the samples that were being collected, most common ones were brain, blood, and neuroimaging. And I think it's also worth noting that about 29% of the studies did not report what samples were being collected, even though it's considered to be a clinical research study on Alzheimer's disease. So we found 4 major approaches for recruiting African American participants in Alzheimer's disease. So the most common was community outreach, advertisement, and then collaboration with healthcare providers, and least common was referral. On the last slide, I also mentioned that there were 2 major types of study designs. Most common was pre-post, and second most common was post-test only. And the methods for evaluating the effectiveness of each of these 4 different recruitment approaches, they really vary depending on the study design. So if we take a look, I didn't mean to do that. So if we take a look at pre-post studies, these studies often reported the proportion of African American participants who were enrolled before and then after a recruitment approach was implemented. And so this resulted in a % increase of African American participants at follow-up compared to baseline. And then in contrast, if you take a look at the post-test only studies, these papers often reported the proportion of African American participants who were enrolled out of the entire target sample. And so this resulted in a % recruitment rate from either a single or multiple recruitment approaches. So if we take a look at the first one, community outreach as a recruitment approach, it had a 13.5% median increase among studies that had a pre-post study design. And it also had a 53% median recruitment rate among studies that were using a post-test only study design. I'm not going to go through all the numbers shown here, but as you can see, in general, community outreach was one of the more effective ways of recruiting African American participants. And the full results of all the recruitment approaches are in the folder. It's on the right-hand side of your folder, and there are two tables that I provided. So in Table 1, I provide detailed evaluation results for all the recruitment approaches, and I also broke it down into the sub-approaches. So for example, community outreach, this is broken down into community presentations, educational programming materials, engaging community leaders, and also finally, direct contact with potential participants. And then in Table 2, I also provide detailed descriptions of what each of these different recruitment and retention approaches are, which I will talk about very soon. So I also did a sub-analysis among studies that implemented all 4 recruitment approaches at the same time and also evaluated the effectiveness of each of the recruitment approaches. And so among these studies, collaborations with healthcare providers and community outreach were generally some of the more effective ways of recruiting African American participants, as shown here by one study done by Bicot in 1996. So in terms of retention, we found around like 20 unique retention approaches, which we then collapsed into these 3 major themes. So the 2 most common was follow-up communication, maintaining community relationships, and also ensuring convenience for the participants. So earlier I mentioned there were 5 studies that were on retention, and among those 5, there were 4 studies, or 80%, that provided evaluation results. And among all the studies that were looking at retention, they implemented multiple retention approaches at the same time. And so this prevented us from delineating the effectiveness of each of the different retention approaches. So instead, I looked at what were the approaches that were common among the studies with the highest retention rates. And there were 2 that stood out. First was follow-up communication, especially using mail. And second was maintaining community relationships, such as partnering with local programs and hosting annual recognition events for the participants. And finally, I just wanted to conclude with summarizing promising approaches for recruiting and retaining African American participants. First, using elements of community outreach and collaborating with healthcare providers appear to be some of the more effective ways of recruiting African American participants. And I just want to add that a lot of the studies that were using community outreach, they often discuss that they intentionally use this approach to build trust and establish a relationship with the community. And then second, follow-up communication and maintaining community relationships appear to be some of the more effective ways of retaining African American participants in Alzheimer's disease research. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Susie Stark. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So I spent some time looking at Roger's results, and I thought that it was a great opportunity for us to think about some of the areas of growth that we could have as we launch into these working groups and really think about how we can improve the evidence for recruitment and retention. Full disclosure, I know there's qualitative researchers in the room. I'm an occupational therapist, and although I was raised by Alzheimer's disease researchers, I'm a fall prevention clinical trialist, and my love is community engaged research. So some of what I'm going to talk about is informed by that other hat that I wear sometimes. So some of the limitations that Roger and Nancy Moore-Howell and I talked about in the current literature were some issues with lack of operational definitions and really understanding the secret sauce that people put into some of their studies to actually define what we did so we can replicate these in future studies. We often had a lack of comparison conditions, so we didn't know what we were comparing against. A lack of cost information, and I think the costs of what we spend to go in, the real costs of what recruitment and retention costs, and even what the costs of losing participants might be if they don't stay into studies. We did not have really great definitions or descriptions of the interventions in some cases, and really little theoretical discussion of why things might work. So those are some of the things I thought I could challenge us to think about as we move ahead in the science is first some operational definitions, and another admission is that we're working on a retention study with with Pittsburgh and with Madison and Irvine, and we've all realized that we have different descriptions of what we mean by a missed visit or even sometimes a dropout. So beginning to have conversations and consensus about what we mean by those definitions. Fully defining outcomes. What do we want to know? Is it a percent recruited from a pool of participants? Is it a percent retained, but a percent retained for how long, or how many missed visits are okay, and for what procedures? And understanding and actually carefully measuring important covariates that we might learn from, and beginning to collect these systematically across our centers. We know age and gender, family member with Alzheimer's disease, trust of researchers might be another variable that we might want to think about measuring consistently. Whether or not somebody's still driving, what their functional status or change in function might have looked like, their CDR status or a change in status, death of a study partner, number of ancillary studies is another variable I'm interested in understanding with regard to retention in studies. I'm really interested in us doing a better job of characterizing what we actually do. I believe the quality of interventions varies by researcher and site in some cases, and if we can systematize and characterize what we do better, we might actually be able to understand what level of quality we need to reach with regard to our interventions to make them effective. So some of the things I was thinking about is dose, not in terms of milligram of a drug, but how many times or how many actual touches of a person do we need in order to get them to be retained. We're not really sure about that. What are the essential elements of a recruitment or a retention intervention? And what are the active ingredients that we need to have? So is it some motivational enhancement strategies that we use to help people really use shared decision making to understand what it means for them to participate in a study? And how do we define that, and how do we ensure that we're all doing that the same way if we're going to compare across sites? I'm really interested in the Melita effect and how we can train all of our recruitment and retention outreach workers to have that same level of high touch, compassion, cultural competency. I think those are some really important variables that have been brought up today that we can all begin to address across sites. Beginning to understand theoretical underpinnings that we want to use. We know that when we deliver behavioral interventions, if interventionists understand the basic theory of why we're doing what we're doing, they're more effective when they deliver interventions. And I think the same would be true for retention and recruitment strategies. I think capturing the true costs of intervention will be important for us to understand the cost effectiveness and also understanding the downside of losing participants. So some of the challenges I think that we have in beginning to study and addressing maybe all of these applications that will come rolling in for the R24, our RCT is really feasible in this space. We have such small sizes of African American participants in single centers that right now we're probably not poised to study this as a single site. We really can't afford in this space to not use best practices. We can't afford to not have best practices compared to better practices. Are we going to study recruitment only, or are we going to study recruitment and retention, and what does that mean? I think costs are a challenge, and I think agreement and trust across and within centers to test these strategies is an important challenge we need to think about and talk about today. Opportunities, though, we have this great collaborating center and this great infrastructure that we can build on. We have existing data and systems that we already use to share this data, and I think that can only be built on to begin to look at some of these other important variables that we have with recruitment and retention. An amazing large national cohort, if you think about it, and cores dedicated to recruitment and retention. If we can capitalize on these opportunities, I think we could put together a pretty amazing application to study this issue. So that is our challenge. That is what we hope to begin discussing today. I think there's other additional resources that we can think about that we have access to. We have community engaged research strategies, which have certainly led the day today. And we also have implementation research strategies that I think we can borrow and use to help us begin to answer these tough questions. We also have really great strategies to develop and understand and measure behavioral interventions. In the ADC, ADRC community, there's certainly a growing literature. There's certainly a growing cadre of studies that are focused on recruitment and retention that are interested and biased against, I think, understanding subgroups, and in particular, what will it take to help African Americans recruit into our studies and then to stay with us. So, how can we strengthen the evidence of cost-effective recruitment and retention strategies? Can we design common measures? Can we come up with common strategies, cost information that we all want to collect? Can we take advantage of these amazing existing practices that we've heard about this morning and these data centers that we have to help us? And can we come up with some type of study? So this is if Susie Stark was cleaning the world, but John Morris calls it a straw man proposal. This is what I would do if I was to design a study. I think I would begin with consensus on some of those variables and some of the data points that we need to use. I would use the existing NAC structure that we have that's so powerful. I would leverage CTSA, the Clinical Translational Science Award resources that we have across our institutions to help us design effective multi-center trials. Use some type of centralized staff training so we can all have Melitas at our centers to make sure that we're able to deliver interventions well and with fidelity. And I would propose that we use some kind of pragmatic trial, like a stepped wedge design that would perhaps give us our own pool of centers, but maybe even other aging centers across the country to help us test some best case scenario pool of interventions that we want to have to see if they would actually work. And I would include people to help us with cost effectiveness. I'm going to move on from that, but I also think that we need to have a team, a huge team of people with expertise in a wide range of areas. They include community members, community-engaged researchers, ADRC, ADC leadership, biostats, people who understand procedures, people who understand recruitment and retention, pragmatic trials, how to manualize this so we know what we have when we're done, implementation, and health science research. So that is our charge. I'm excited to move into these work groups, and I'm sure by the end of the day we'll all have some exciting research designs, and I look forward to your report back in a little bit to hear how they go. Thank you.
Okay, on your schedule it says we're going to break, but we actually have time for questions. So let's thank our speakers again and have everyone come down. Where's Krista? Come down and we'll take questions. Up there.
Thank you so much. So regarding best practices for recruitment and retention of African Americans in Alzheimer's disease research, I've heard much about cultural sensitivity, but nothing about linguistic sensitivity, right? What are we doing to ensure that our assessments are adapted to variations in dialects spoken across the country, and also numerous times you refer to Caribbean American populations and also recent immigrants from various countries in Africa. Most likely those folks are not monolingual, right? What are we doing to attend to those linguistic backgrounds? Because the potential pitfalls are substantial, right? That old adage, you don't want to mistake a language difference for a disorder, right?
Oh, push the button. Ooh, fancy. I think that's an excellent question. It hasn't come up in any of the discussions that I've been a part of. I know that NIA and NAC has worked very hard to have the Hispanic forms of the uniform data set out there. I think that's a great question. I think speaks to this heterogeneity aspect. I think we probably need to talk more about it because it hasn't come up in the conversations I've been a part of.
No.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask before we go into the breakout sessions, some of the questions I think are being raised throughout the day. Who are we studying? And what are we studying? Because I think once we have some clarification on these two questions, we can better talk about strategies. And to me, at least, having been on the work group as well as doing what we do, it's not very clear to me Are we studying pure Alzheimer's disease defined clinically? Are we studying mixed vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease plus pure Alzheimer's disease, but excluding vascular dementia? Are we including other things? And who are we studying? Are we studying Americans whose parents were born in this country? Are we studying Americans who call themselves Americans, and which is one definition? And are we studying all comers?
Do you want us to go for this, or do you? No. Okay.
Dr. Morris is saying he will illuminate us after we're done.
I'm not sure, my name's Suzanne Schindler and I'm from WashU. I'm not sure if this is the right place to ask this question, but Krista's kind of talked about a number of different working groups and different aspects of this. So one question I have is, we heard about how African Americans are so underrepresented in clinical trials. And I was just wondering, we're talking about studying African Americans in an academic context, but I haven't really heard anything about including them in clinical trials by drug companies. Do you know if this is something that's on the radar for drug companies? Is this something they're working on? And certainly anything that academics find will be informative for that, but I just don't even know if that's something that they're considering in their design for drug trials.
I've never had a panel where I could answer none of the questions. So do you have any?
So, when the clinical working group was, that was one of the things that they pushed forward, is that this needs to be a push in clinical trials. I know someone said that they were here from Genentech. I don't know if she wants to speak, but I think that drug companies are thinking about this. I believe it was the A4 trial, where at least every 10th person you screened had to be from an underrepresented group. Can someone nod if I'm not making the wrong trial or something? So I think that drug companies are thinking about it too, but I definitely, I think as a research community and as an Alzheimer community, I think we're all on board that this needs to change, not just in the academic centers, but across the swath.
Is Josh here? Josh Grill? Oh, he left. I want to hear Josh's answer on this. We were just talking about this. Right here.
So I think there's universal agreement that this is critical, and I think that it's sort of been the elephant in the room for me all day. Ultimately, I think what we're really trying to do here is instruct clinical practice, and in the end, we hope that that'll be through better treatments that we can offer people, either to help their memory or prevent them from developing this disease. And it'll be critical to know how new treatments are as more or less effective in populations, and certainly as more or less safe in different populations. And so I think ultimately everything we're talking about is going to have to impact the way we do clinical trials. And unfortunately, we have a worse record in diverse participation in trials than we do in other areas of Alzheimer's disease research. In industry-sponsored trials, it's actually as low as 3% for all non-white races and ethnicities in one 10-year period. And in NIH studies, it's about 10% universally. The A4 study did try very hard to achieve better rates of diverse participation, but ultimately the decision came down to, are we going to finish this study in a timely way, or are we going to finish it in a diverse way? And this is the difficult challenge that investigators face. And so several of us, Laura Baker's in the room, Tiffany Chow's in the room, so several of us are charged with trying to figure out ways to improve our performance in clinical trials moving forward. But I think the thing we've heard today, and the WashU example is maybe the best, is that sometimes it takes decades to move the needle on these issues, and we've got a lot of work to do. And clearly, one of the things we're charged with is trying to find ways to institute in many different sites some of the principles that we're hearing today that really begin with going to the community, demonstrating your willingness to provide services and information, and working toward ultimately improvements in participation rates. But I think ultimately changing the rates in clinical trials is going to be the most critical aspect of our topic today.
Kristen in the back there? Way back? No, Kristen? Good. Josh, Kristen, will you get the mic from Josh?
Okay. Hi, my name is Chloe Jackson from Johns Hopkins. I will be brief. My question is, and some people already touched on it, what exactly is your definition of being African American? And the reason why I'm asking this is because when a person is reporting as African American, it could be very different. So if a person is Nigerian or from, they have origins and family from Africa, they actually won't report as being African American. And it could also be the same for Caribbean descent as well. So I think we're doing an injustice by putting everyone in the same general category, even though there are very, very vast differences in culture and language and many other aspects as well.
Last comment from Mary?
So I just wanted to enhance one of Josh's comments. You know, the outreach was very great for clinical trials. Even industry trials, we often get good support to reach out. But the thing to keep in mind is all of the things that we've been talking about today, the comorbidity, the other risks and the burdens of the trial can really reduce their ability to participate. But my recollection from the most recent reports from the A4 study is that after we got through all of those medical consequences, when you took that group and you started imaging, the minority or diversity cohort was equally eligible for the trial as the non-Hispanic white cohorts. So the trial is open, but we need in the meantime to figure out how to service all of those other needs that may get in the way of them addressing a participation in a trial.
Okay, well, with that, let's thank Lisa and our speakers for their presentations. And we're going to take a break in just a moment, but if you look in your packet, there is a sheet of paper that says breakout sessions. So I'd like you to pull that out. Now, anyone can attend any breakout session that they wish, so no assigned breakout sessions. But these are the topics and the moderators. Excuse me, everyone. These are the topics and the moderators. We're going to begin the breakout sessions at 10 till 3. And you're going to discuss things. I'll try to answer William's charge in just a moment. You're going to go from 10 till 3 until 3:40, so you'll have 50 minutes. Every breakout session will have a moderator and someone to record. Coming back to William's question, what are we trying to address and in whom are we trying to address the questions? Frankly, we left this extremely unstructured. You can decide that. And that could be a topic of discussion in your breakout session. So you can decide the parameters of what you want to discuss and what you want to bring forth. Now at 3:40, you'll break, but we'll come back here by 4, and we're going to hear from 3 of the breakout sessions what the discussion was and what the proposals may be to go forward. So once again, we're going to start the breakout sessions at 2:50. You can go to any breakout session you wish. Personally, I'm going to the one with Dave Notman and Jen Manley. No, you're free to go.
Hey, is everyone here for the first working group on improving community trust in medical research? I would like to ask that if you are, if we can sit kind of in this main area here so we can all hear one another when we speak, since I don't think we have enough microphones to go around, and we're going to be sharing our thoughts. Is that okay? Is that okay? All right. So we roughly have at this point a little under 40 minutes to talk about improving community trust in medical research. So I have a couple of questions that I would like to just be open format for us here. One geared toward what we are thinking based off of coming off of today, but also taking a look forward. So my first question is, what are the key takeaways that we have here today, the audience? What are our lingering questions regarding trust in African American participation? I think that will set the stage for how we think about going forward. So I'm opening up the floor. I can lead on that with my thoughts here. My biggest takeaway is the diverse group of people, diversity in African Americans as well, who are interested in and working toward this goal. So we have a great group already here, so that's one of my takeaways. But one of my lingering questions is, what is next? And that's what I'm posing to you guys second. But what are your lingering thoughts or questions after we end or wrapping up today?
My thoughts would still be the trust issue among the participants, especially those of us who recruit. And we recruit and we bring them in, and sometimes what they see when they get there is not what we saw. I think I shared with you my pain when someone said that I did a bait and switch, because I was an African American recruiter, and I go out into the Detroit area and I recruit them. But when they get there, I'm not there when they get there, and all they see, or they don't see anyone of color. And so then I get the call back saying, it's a bait and switch thing. So I want to continue to build trust with them, and I don't know if it's okay when I go out to say that when you come in, you may not, so that they will know what to expect.
Okay.
The element of surprise.
I was just going to share, I was just in the lobby with someone that helped as a volunteer here, and she said, I was thinking about it, but when I saw those white people in white coats, it scared me, and I just don't trust white people. But I might still do it though, but that was just like, just 5 minutes ago. And after this whole, thing just went down, I was like, wow, white men in white coats.
Are scary.
Whereas it's kind of like that vision of the Ku Klux Klan, And so when you have those fears associated with that, it's not gonna, you can't move the needle past that vision,
So how do you think, or what is a strategy that you think may reach the person where they are? So the person that you may have seen, what's a strategy that we could think about in terms of reaching someone who just left here but still expressed those fears?
Well, I just did a presentation in East Oakland.
Oh.
Like 26 participants, all at the East Oakland Center, and I asked, what is it your fear?
Yeah.
They said they don't want to know. They'd rather not know. And, it's like, how do you prepare if you don't know? And so I asked the audience, what is it that we can do to help increase our numbers? As far as me being a recruiter, I'm there to educate you and to possibly sign you up as a participant, but they don't want to know.
We have someone here and here with thoughts. White shirt first, please.
Yeah, so just for me, as a postdoc, I chose to raise the question of can I go out and do community engagement? One of the things the staff does when people that I recruited come in, they make sure they see me. So if I'm in the office, they'll say, oh, the person we recruited, either they let me know ahead of time
too. Yeah.
I always wonder, as I'll be leaving, and the people I recruited, how will they feel when I'm no longer there? And are they going to be taken care of once I'm gone? So those are my questions.
Okay.
And I know that involves the issue of trust as well on my part.
Yes. So I'm hearing, first part is that you at least have some continuity of communication with your current team. So that's essential. So no one person knows what the other is doing, and knowing what the participant needs is the continuity of that relationship once you move forward with your career. I think so. Oh, I see two people. Okay, let's hear first. Oh, sorry. You sure? Okay, sorry.
Halfway comment. My serious part is this, the information that we heard from Dr. Thomas, I believe.
Yes.
The thing that impressed me most was what I concluded he was saying was, and that was, in terms of getting people involved, you have to have a relationship. And the work that they did in the community suggested that they were intent, before getting people involved in research, they were intent on establishing good working relationships, good relationships, period. And so I take that away from this conference today, that, before we can get people involved with regard to trust, you don't trust people automatically. You have to have some sort of relationship. I think that's the part that needs to be worked on, regardless of what aspect we're working on. Excuse me, at the end of the day, it's about relationship.
Now, I have a question. I know we have two other folks here. Oh, sorry. So he was saying that trust has to be predicated upon a relationship. In response to that, I know we have two other folks. I pose a question to you all we can chew on. Do we think researchers are afraid to go out and do the hard work with communities and really build that trust? Because it is an extra skill set there. So that's just simply posing it to you guys that we can chew on together here, but not necessarily scared as in true fear, but simply what they may hear or the amount of effort it may take, or that it may knock their own research ideas off their square. So that kind of fear. I think we had her here and then. Yeah. Oh, great.
When you go out the door, because I think we learned that the hard way in Boston as well, that one of the lack of trust is to the big institutions, to the Brigham and Women's Hospital, to the MGH, and we may not have done anything specifically as researchers to have caused that distrust, but they have distrust in that health system because when they come in, they don't see people like that frequently in our big hospitals. And that's our fault. And one of the things I was going to suggest to you before you leave your postdoc is talk to your PI that he needs to hire someone just like you. You know what I mean? Because I'm sure he's got to replace you in some way. And I really believe that we have to foster minority junior investigators and postdocs like you, because we're never going to solve this problem if we don't have people of color going out into our neighborhoods, with us. So.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is James Williams. I'm a social worker here at the Newman Project Satellite, and I've worked here for 23 years. And early on, we discussed the prospect of trust, and I say it all the time in the beginning. You don't have to do no mimics, don't have to tell folks that we presenting this and we're giving you this. Tell them the truth about the research, educate them about what you're doing, and tell them the truth, and let them decide whether they want to participate or not. All the mimics and, all the other stuff. Put that aside and just tell them the truth about what you're doing.
So what do
Get information, and get them involved in research. Tell them the truth.
So what do you mean by mimics?
Well, they have all types of gimmicks to get folks to participate.
I see.
You know, you don't need to do that. Educate them about the program about Alzheimer's and about the services that's available. Provide them services to let them continue to stay in their home independently with the appropriate services to help and go from there. And the folks will participate. We've seen over 2,000 folks, and it was a group of 3 of us that went out in the community, and we provided services for the folks and gained their trust. And that's how we got them to participate.
Her right here, right there, young lady? Yes, you've been waiting.
There needs to be a better collaborative effort between the recruiters and also, I said I think there needs to be a better collaborative effort between the recruiters as well as the researchers or the research staff. And I can't speak to everyone else's study, but I also do recruitment for the 30 studies that we have. And unfortunately, I'm the only person who goes out in the community and talks to people and educates people. And it's a big undertaking. Like, I'm just one person. I can't do that for the whole department, even though I have everything. But it definitely makes a big difference if the recruiter or the research staff or the researchers out there in the community with me, whether or not they're a person of color, because it shows community members that could potentially be involved in our studies that they're actually trying to make a difference and they're not just sending the recruiter out because they have their own skin color and they want that collaboration to go on as far as recruitment for the person of color. So I think it definitely, there needs to be a better team effort between the two departments.
Well, you raise a good issue then. So my question now, in terms of next steps, is matching or having, say, racial compatibility between researchers, research staff, and participants, is that really where we want to go? Is that more important than having someone who is competent? I think that's something we can think about. Of course. Yeah.
I mean, I think that that's important.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I hear when I go out into the community is that, obviously, that they're so proud of me. I get that a lot.
Yeah.
But it's my passion. This is a value for me. It's a value in my life to give back to my community. So when I go out, obviously, I take all that with me. And I think that because it's personal to me, that's what draws people in. And I'm not saying I'm the only one that has that passion because I'm a brown person, but I'm saying that I know that that's what makes the connection when I go out.
Up here, I think she's.
I'm going to speak very frankly, because this is my husband, and I've watched him since I've been married to him for 27 years. I've watched him work tirelessly.
Yeah.
Freeman Award winner, you know, anybody who knows him knows what I'm talking about. They just love him in the city of St. Louis. I don't even have friends anymore because they're all his friends now. Because my parents got older, they don't call me anymore, they call him. So that's the kind of person. Unfortunately, as of the end of the month, that wonderful field work that they're doing is over. Okay? I mean, it's stopping, I guess, because of funding or whatever. So my concern is a couple of fold. And I'll just say this one thing. What are we really doing? Are we serious about our efforts, or are we just talking research dollars, talking what we think people want to hear, and not getting to the people? And that's, you know, I mean, because it takes something when somebody calls and says, I need a bedside toilet. It's a whole lot different. You know what I'm talking about? When you have to go out in the trenches and provide services to people, you know what I'm talking about. So what are we doing? Where are we really, and I think that we need to explore that. Are we looking at research for research's sake, or are we really getting to the people? We talked about this at lunch a little bit. Are we getting to the people? And again, I'm a layperson when I say we, okay? But
Of course.
that's something that I think we need to look at.
I think we have someone here that wants to chime in.
University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm an outreach specialist as well. So I want to say a couple of things. One is that I agree totally. You always tell the truth. You have to be transparent. And you talk about what you know might be people's barriers when you first engage in a conversation. Because I feel that goes a long way, not trying to hide anything. And that means who your team is. So, you know, we're a small population of African Americans in Madison, Wisconsin. So we do other things. I did photographs of people, so they'll know when you come in, this is who you'll see. But also, like you, I meet people for the visit, take them to the coordinator. But then there was the added responsibility of working within the institution on those teams of people, observing them and how they interact with participants, and also giving them some helpful, you know, information. Like, did you realize you never once looked at that person in their face? You know, you're always looking to the side, you know, afterwards. So trying to help people understand, okay, I go out and recruit this person, but like you, these are our elders. They're very precious to me. Their experiences are very precious to me. And even if they don't know Tuskegee, they know racism. They know health disparities. So I don't want to bring them in and turn them over to someone who will be disrespectful or will. I did have one man to get up and lead the appointment because I had suggested to them, please don't talk about brain donations on the first visit.
Of course.
But they didn't hear me. And that man got up and left because it frightened him. And I felt like, okay, it's all right to be frightened. And I'm saying, this has been a good conversation. This has helped us all get more ideas of how we can, because the fundamental thing is African Americans must be in the research. We must be a part of the cure. We must have the drugs. We must have the intervention. So that for me is the driving force. And then the question was asked about the money. I understand what they're saying because we have now met our recruitment goals.
You said have not or have?
We have met our
Have.
recruitment goals.
Got it.
But for me, if you're still saying we're the leading, we lead in this disease, maybe we need to up the recruitment goals. We need to over sample. So right now, we're no longer doing baselines. But when you're shifting into another program to do baseline, but then I'm thinking as a recruiter, now I'm going to have to start over because that team of coordinators, I don't know them. I haven't observed how they interact. There's no people of color on that team. So it almost feels like I'm starting all over. So I think part of it is we just don't need one job. We need more than one job because part of what I've been doing there too is talking about we have to hire, we just have to hire more people on the upper echelons that are African American and other people of color. And so we have seen more diversity on the staff. But all of these things, of course, come at a price. But again, the bottom line is African Americans must be in the research in order to be a part of the solution, in order that the medications will work for us, in order that we can one day solve and cure this disease. So that is paramount. And we understand, I think, on that platform, people can hear you when you say that. We have to be a part of the research. So let's do everything we can as a team to make this work for you, to make it respectful for you, to make you stay in the research, to make you, you know, consider giving brain donation after we've done all these other things, including giving you services, including helping to retain you.
I think you raised a lot of good ideas about let's move toward what do we identify as the base level next step. So now that we can describe the issue and some of our lingering issues and questions, what are some of our ideas on what would be something that we can do next to move forward with our research efforts?
I also think, and I agree with
Yeah.
everything that you said, I do think that we definitely do need to have more African Americans involved, but at the same time, honestly, I feel that, and I can't speak to everyone else's situation, I'm speaking to myself, but honestly, I feel that just because I'm African American and I'm out there engaging that community, that does not automatically mean that that population is automatically going to say, oh yeah, sign me up. That's not how it works. And I feel that when I'm dealing with people that are not African American, they automatically think, oh, she's black, she can speak to people, she's highly whatever. And that's going to push people coming into our center. And that's just not the reality of the situation. We can't, it's not fair to impose that on someone.
I cannot agree more. I think a big next step then is to not confuse racial matching with cultural competency. Being that I'm from Louisiana originally and I've been in the field from Boston to New Hampshire, DC, Chicago, people can clock me as a mile away as not belonging to a particular community. But that's okay when you're armed with culturally competent techniques there and understanding of who we're talking about locally. So I think to head us off, we can have, one, just a recognition that that is not the same. Being black does not mean that you are qualified or culturally competent to lead those efforts or engage, but then also making sure everyone is like a prerequisite to have that training when someone is either being interviewed or hired. I tend to do it at the earlier steps, that discussion. So I think that's a viable next step. I saw some hands here. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Janice. I'm with the Alzheimer's Association.
Janice. Hi.
And I have had a dilemma where I'm a care consultant, so I work with families who are caring for someone who has dementia, trying to identify resources and services to help support them, and educate them on the disease and all of that. One of the things that we are tasked with is trying to recruit for research. And I have issues with that. I've had issues with that, could be because of my age. And I do remember a lot of things that went on in the past. Here in St. Louis, I remember my mother saying she did not have a warm feeling towards this institution, WashU Lawrence Hospital, because of experiences that she had in her childbearing years. And one of her children or two might have been born here, and the difference in the treatment that they received from that of their white counterparts was vast. So I have struggled with the recruitment piece because I don't know, I've only been with the association about a year and a half. It's good for me coming to workshops like this because I get a chance to meet some of the researchers. Because when I talk with the clients that come in and I talk about research, the African American clients, of course, they'll be a little bit more open with me because I am black.
Okay.
And they'll say, well, I don't know, because what will they do with my information? How do I know that they're not just using me, or how do I know? I don't really have an answer. I really don't. I mean, because I don't know exactly what is being done with that information. So there was somebody who said sending a researcher out with a recruiter, and I think that's a really good idea because it gives those prospective participants a chance to talk directly to a recruiter so they can ask them those questions. Well, why should I trust you? What will you do with my information?
I remember Tuskegee or Henrietta Lacks or, you know, and what happened there. How do I know that this won't be the same thing? Because I can't answer those questions. Also, the young lady back here who said just because we're Black or African American, you can't, that doesn't always give you credibility among all African Americans. Because if you don't live in their community and you're coming in there, they might still look at you
Of course.
and say, well, you know, well, you don't live here, so you don't really know.
Yeah.
So it's a struggle for me to recruit. And the association here in St. Louis does not have a really good reputation, to be honest. So we have a hard uphill climb to work in the African American community, and not only African Americans, but LGBTQIA as well as the Hispanic community to try to build trust. So I am here more or less to listen and try to find strategies and tactics that we can use to reach these communities, and even to build my own trust that I am not, that I won't end up doing harm.
I agree.
So
That, I must admit, that was one of my own struggles in thinking and how do I critically think about that. I also do training for researchers and physicians around cultural competency. So what does it actually look like? The steps, how do you know when you're in dangerous terrain, and how to really pose it to yourself? As to me, I think of, and I think all of us should think of ourselves as citizen scientists, but I am a researcher, but also a Black woman. So I'm at a nice interface there. And I think maybe having more discussions with people that like that can help build some of your trust. Also thinking about it, almost looking glass self to say what are the needs of the researcher as well as the parallel needs for the participant that can facilitate. But I see a person with their hand up here. Yeah. Sure.
Researchers don't have that kind of power over their participants and things. So that was kind of, as I was reading that book, it's like, I sure hope we've come long enough, far enough from that to be able to educate people and let them know that research has changed a lot. Since
Doctor, you said this morning a very important point.
Okay. Yes. So I see engagement as going both ways, so bidirectional. So it is my job as a researcher in the institutions that I reside at to reach out and engage. So I see it as a partnership. So for me to be transparent. This is what I'm doing. Monday, I'm going out and I'm just having a conversation with seniors in our community, African American seniors, just to let them know who I am. I'm new to Rush. This is my research study. I would love if you can join. If not, here's some information that I have here, and they can get to know me as a woman, a little more, a wife, a daughter, etc. So just a little bit more personable touch. However, we also have on the converse, the other side, having participant engagement, so that willingness to hear researchers speak or try to be transparent as we see fit, because we can determine, I think especially as African Americans, we could think about, well, is this a safe space or am I getting the right cue here? But being open to that. Am I open to hearing what she has to say, what she may ask, and being comfortable with even saying yes at times. So that's what I meant by engaging. I think it's two ways there, that we have to go out and they have to come forward and we meet together. I think right here, or, oh, excuse me, the young lady had her hand up for a while. Sorry. Okay. And where are you?
I'm at the University of Alabama in Birmingham.
Okay, UAB. I just said UAB?
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect. I don't know UAB, I'll take the whole entire thing.
Okay.
But so I work, so I am the main one that they spend 3 hours with me in the room on testing them. And I also go over the consent form as well too. And while we're going over the consenting, I talk about HIPAA, I talk about
IRB.
And I also know that there are a lot of checks and balances in place to where, we can only do so much with your information. I always let them know too, at any point in time that you want to discontinue the study, please let us know and we'll shred on your information. I'm very transparent. Whatever we have not processed can be destroyed. And also letting them know that outside of the research team, nobody knows who you are. If this ever gets published, you will be known as a number. You won't know the number, I won't know the number, is randomized. So I do let them know that. And then also when it comes to the engagement side, we have actually worked with the city of Birmingham and worked with the mayor's office to kind of go to the communities that have been left out. A lot of the times these communities have lost their hospital, they've lost schools, so we kind of go out to them to kind of engage. And by me being against the face to our community, they see me once they come into the office. They know, oh, this is the same girl that told me about this stuff. And it also helps too that I'm also part of a sorority, and so we're doing a lot of engagements with them. A lot of stuff is word of mouth. It takes one negative person, it's one negative review to mess up your entire recruitment process. So we try to keep it as positive by doing luncheons, providing free lunch and learns, or free dinner and learns. That way, the incentive is to feed you, not just like your stomach, but also your mind as well too. Because a lot of the times these people, they don't know where to go. So we go out to their community, hosting events in their community centers, especially for our elderly population. It's hard for them to even come downtown. Downtown Birmingham is ridiculous. So we make it easier on them to where we can reach out to them, that way they know, like, hey, we're here, we're located, but we'll still come to you.
I'm just going to shorten what I'm about to say. What I'm hearing around the room,
Mm-hmm.
to me, at the end of the day, it's still about relationships. What do
I
we
agree.
do? When do we do it? Why do we do it? So it's building trust, it's letting people know who we are, why we're there, what we want to do, how they can become a part of something. I don't think we can get away from that.
Or I think if you personally don't have a relationship with the community, as I'm at UCLA, I'm a postdoc there. I know I never gave my name, I'm Valencia.
Yeah.
What I did was I partnered with a coordinator at the Alzheimer Disease Association who has relationships. And when they have talks, she calls me and asks me, can you come? And from that, people that meet me at those engagements, they ask me for my information, and they contact me and say,
Edna?
Yeah, I think too that we in University of Michigan, we utilize the faith-based organization. And so when we go into the churches, we sponsor it. But to the young lady who's a recruiter, one of the expectations for anyone that's doing recruitment is that you go through everything that you're telling people about. It helps you to understand the whole process, like the consenting process, the your exams. And so if you're a part of it, I'm performed the neurological exams at the ULM, but I'm also an outreach coordinator. And back to that trust that I was asking the doctor about, I think that if we're going out and we're of color and we're bringing people in, we've got to prepare them for the fact that I can't be every place all the time. So when you come in, you may not see people of color, but we're still there and we're still advocating for you. So if you just keep the faith, because I think that's where our weakness is that at one point from 2008 to 2017, I did recruitment and renewal exams. So most of the African Americans that came in, they saw me on both sides. Now we've increased our numbers, and so I can't do it all. So they're not going to see the same person that came out to see them. But the mere fact that we are with the pastoral alliances for all the major cities around the Ann Arbor area, going into the church is where we establish our relationship. And so therefore, once the pastor of the church is on board, the rest of the people come. And we've increased from 3% to over 48% African Americans at the U of M base because of that. But it was through Pastoral Alliance, and that's the faith-based organization that gets you into the door. And so we go and we speak on Sundays. And so it does mean working outside of the regular work hours on Wednesday nights, Sundays, and then Saturdays. But it has worked for us, and it is an effective method. And coming into that door at the church actually establishes a relationship. So I'm going.
Right here. Haven't heard from you. No, you. You.
Hi, my name is Melissa Terry. I'm from the University of Pittsburgh, and I also am an outreach coordinator.
That's also a copy.
I'm just with one team. But recruitment is ongoing. It's not a 9-to-5 job or 8-to-5 job. It's ongoing. Even when you're walking in the grocery store and I'm with my family, you bump into someone who's like, oh, you're the one who did the speech, and I need to call you on my phone or my cell phone ring. And it's an ongoing process. It's not something that, you can just turn on and turn off if you're committed to the process. It requires several touches. And that's all part of building rapport with several touches. So before you can even start the recruitment process, there are several touches that are required to build trust in the community. And I also agree, just because you are African American or Black, however you consider yourself to identify with, it still is, it is a hard recruit. It's not an easy recruit. And that being said, you have to deal with the elephant that's in the room. So what I have found that works for me is I talk about those things that nobody wants to talk about, but I bring it up so that it clears the air, so it opens up for friendly dialogue, back and forth dialogue, so that there's an understanding that yes, I know you are afraid. I deal with the fear that people may have participating in research. I deal with the miseducation of recruitment. And so those type of things are critical when you're talking about building a relationship in the African American community. And I share in my center, I said, it may take me 3 touches before you get a recruit. It may take 4. I said, well, I want to go to a African American golf networking event. And look down and be like, why are you going there? Well, guess what? Now we've established a relationship with the African American Chamber of Commerce. They want to do a series with us on African American and Alzheimer's disease. So you never can box in what recruitment looks like because it comes in all different avenues, and you really have to be open to being
So group, we have about 5 minutes left. We can decide I can recap what I've been hearing, or we have time for final thoughts. Sure. So for me, thinking about it, and also in the field, cultural competency is more than simply respect for a particular group of people, and it's across African Americans, Asians, LGBTQIA, even rural whites. So I think we tend to overlook the impact of diversity within whites as well as blacks, meaning that if we think of all whites as privileged or educated or high income, and we think of blacks as the opposite, then we've ultimately failed science. So it's really at a local level, understanding who am I looking to reach and what are they concerned about, what methods would they be willing to receive the information, and also having a timeline on we have the engage model where we network first. What may that look like? And it can vary from, say, where I live, it can vary from the west side of Chicago to the south side of Chicago. But that is up to the person being able to make an educated timeline, not simply, oh, blacks don't want to be in the study, but really, what are the groups that want to be engaged? Where are they going? Who are they? How can I get in touch with that person? So I really agree with the man here that relationships are key. But through those relationships, we are able, if we are open as a part of cultural competency, of really understanding as researchers, are we really ready to engage? And are we really ready to hear what is on the other side of that engagement? So my cultural competency training guides physicians and researchers and other staff through being able to ask yourself those hard questions prior or even during engaging with particular populations. Yeah. And I have step-by-step is less abstract. Yes.
I was just real curious because it says building trust.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was really helpful. Even if you're at a golf tournament, they may not want to talk about that's my fear. And I'm gonna have a table anyway, because I got you, because California, we can do that all, year round. That for black men, the fact that we're very successful in getting older women as participants, but it's been,
Hit it. Right here. That's what I was just about, yeah, agree. The accessibility.
What about those 10 that you have? Be your ambassadors if they're so interested. But you can start with those 10 and make sure one, and maybe you can put the talking at once.
He's the advocate.
You said go meet them where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a whole network and with support from the Sigma Foundation. By the end of this calendar year, we will have launched the National Association of Black Barbershops and Salons for Health.
Oh, wow.
So we've
That's
got
awesome.
San Diego barbershops in the
That's great.
I'm actually in the Bay Area, but, yeah, but the guy that's over is the African American guy that's over it, I have a conversation.
You can also think about the husbands. So I work with people who have, apparent Alzheimer. Yeah. And one approach I've taken is because I think in general in research, women, at least in this type of research, it's predominantly by women for the most part. So one thing I did was because I wanted to get people who didn't have a family history of Alzheimer's disease. So I thought, why not recruit their partners? And I actually have had some success with that. Not everyone, but I'd say a high percentage. You get the wife, she's like, hey, I'm doing this, I'm going through content testing and filling out questionnaires. Why don't you come in on the same day and we'll just do this together? And so that might be another approach. I don't know how that would work because, unfortunately where I live, it's a predominantly Caucasian population. But that might also be something to consider.
Okay. Well, group, this has been great. I'm sorry to cut us short. We have a break time. Dr. Morris would like for us to abide by, but I think ending on that positive note is great, and I hope this was beneficial. It was for me, so thank you. We'll see you in a minute.
I personally want to thank all of you for your participation in the breakout sessions. I poked my head in all of them, and it seemed like very active and an energetic discussion, and look forward to getting the reports from everyone. All of the reports from all of the breakout sessions will be utilized in the publication that we're going to generate to let everyone know about the progress and the discussion and the challenges still remaining as we bring this workshop to a close. So I want to thank everyone for their workshop participation. I particularly want to thank the scribes and the moderators, and we appreciate their extra work. So let's give them a round of applause. So we're going to hear reports, nothing formal, just to get a sense of what has been discussed and what needs to be addressed further from 3 of the breakout sessions. That will be session 1, Improving Community Trust in Medical Research. Session 2, Return of Research Results and its relation to recruitment and retention. And Transparency. And appreciate Crystal Glover, who is going to report the output from session 1.
So we were the first breakout session, session 1, Improving Community Trust in Medical Research. And we had a wonderful discussion, and we centered around 2 basic questions. What is the takeaway for today? Also kind of segue into lingering questions. But then also, what would be some of the next steps? So now that we know, the issues there, we have those concretized, what will we do going forward? Because that's where the true challenge is moving forward and trying to push that needle. So Cerise and I believe we have about 10 overarching themes. With most themes, they're likely fluid, and we had about 5 minutes to think about them, but we will give you our basic 10. So the first one really centers around recruiters. So recruiters and their support, meaning they need resource support, so that's financial and more recruiters with them, but also moving away from the single recruiter model. So not one person should be able to hold all the cards or that understanding about one community. So moving towards a more team-based approach in terms of recruitment. So that means that more than one person on the team is able to interface with communities. Communities know more than one face of recruiters, as well as knowing a coherent message between recruiters, meaning, as we had one person point out, that it requires excellent communication and consistent communication. So even as we expand to a team-based approach for recruitment, we're not delivering disparate messages or separate messages, okay? But also a big part with recruit support or recruiter support is having access to researchers. So that means every once in a while, recruiters are able to go out, or researchers are able to go out with recruiters and then make the pitch for their work. Let people see who they are and get a feel for them. One of our big themes, and I'll talk about it a little bit more, is the key place of relationships. Many of us will argue that it is the hub and everything centers or spans from that. So the second theme is cross-team training. So we're engaging and building upon recruiter efforts. So we had a team member here, or a work group member, Edna, who spoke about when she goes out and she's recruiting, as an African American woman, she's the face of the study. However, when the participants show up, they are greeted by people who may not resemble them. So getting people ready, participants ready, to be able to see, okay, this is the process of research. I'm here and I have a hand in everything, of course, but this is what you maybe would like to expect. But that also comes back to continuity of communication between team members. One hand should know what the other hand is doing across all leadership levels, okay? If not, we have a weakening of the relationships and an undermining of all the recruiters' work. Our third is seeing, and I believe Dr. Barnes here mentioned this during her talk, is recruitment as science, and it's something that I believe heavily in, meaning it's okay if we talk about different steps that we're taking or challenges, etc., but being able to systematically understand what's the process, what's the standard operating procedures, what are the steps we go through, how different groups may be able to tweak that, and being able to get it across group and hopefully perhaps across centers about what exactly is going on, what goes into recruitment, and also retention, which is key. And then how do we develop there from evaluating and using benchmarks? So 4 is huge, and that's transparency. So we call for, during our group, transparency on the researcher's part, the institution's part, as well as the participant part. So as one person here today, a social worker, noted, we have to lose the gimmicks. So we have to be able to speak straight about what we are doing. So that requires being familiar with your work and how it's applicable to different communities, and being able to partner with different groups. So not necessarily you in a dominant situation or a dominant role, but partnering. They have something we need and we have something of value to them. So coming at it from that way will help transparency. Number 5 and 6 and 7 I will go with briefly. Number 5 is the personality connection, meaning when we're hiring folks, when we're thinking about training, how is that person able to interface and communicate with diverse populations? And I say that across, say, if you're African American and you're recruiting, or if you're not. We have to have that basic level of being able to have a warm handoff, a warm communication style, as well as just being people, being empathic there. But also a big issue that kind of came big to me was staff understanding. Are the people who are endorsing research or the front line of research, do they understand what we're trying to do with our research? Do they trust the institutions and the researchers to do the right thing by the participants? That's a bit hard for us to hear, as we would assume that everyone is running high octane on the same. However, I think we have to grapple with what are our own lingering questions about research, especially on the staff side. And that bleeds into really explaining the Institutional Review Board and other ethics to participants. Meaning, how far have we come since HeLa cells first broke in 1972? How far have we come since the 1940s and 50s when Tuskegee was at high force there? What are the protections in place in plain language that we are doing our best to protect the information and identities of our participants? But also embedded in that, what are the different levels of research? What are different types of research studies? What are different levels of participation? And I think everyone needs to know that even filling out a survey, participating in a focus group, clinical trials, that's all important for getting the African American narrative out there. To me, it all revolves around health. 8 is the relationships. So building relationships is key, but what goes into the planning and preparation for that? What are the hard steps that really go into building relationships with community organizations and community groups? And we were talking about how recruiting and research is not a 9-to-5 job. It's something that happens in the evenings, at night. It's a lived experience, so you have to be passionate about it in that way. But indeed, the crux is having those relationships solid from top to bottom across the board. We also spoke about innovative outreach and creative outreach. So really it boils down to having an openness on behalf of the participant as well as the researcher. So we had people here that were able to share their different groups, especially around recruiting African American men. We know that women are, African American women make up most of the research participants, but we had innovative and creative approaches to saying, how do we reach out to men? Using family as the unit of participation, not just the single participant, may be a route that we can take in the future. But I leave on the last theme, and it's really a question for us to think about going forward. Knowing how to engage. So having those skills with who are we going to talk to, what are we going to say, and how much are we really ready to put into it, and being honest about that, not just with the participant, but with ourselves and our colleagues with, are we really ready for the challenge that this poses, but knowing that we have the resources, the brain power in order to do it. And I think that's what we have for our first group. Thanks.
So Crystal was ably supported by Cerise, who did the scribing, and we're going to have Jonathan come up in just a moment, but I've been reminded once more, will you please, if you haven't done so already, complete the evaluation form. The information that you have, we'll have people at the door to get it, is that right? The information that you complete will help us when we write up the report of the proceedings. I really want it. And I really want it. And you really want the report? I want it. It's in your hand. What? I want all the evaluation. Oh, okay, tell them, don't tell me. Okay, Cerise says, do it. Fill out that evaluation form. Okay, so Jonathan Jackson was supported by Krista Mulder and going to discuss returning research results in relation to recruitment retention.
All right, so I was part of workshop 2, and I'm going to give you my take while you furiously fill out this evaluation so that you are allowed to leave this room, apparently. But before I do that, I wanted to just take a small moment and ask everybody to look around this room. I would like you to sort of just take a quick note of who has left by this point and who has stayed when we're talking about these kinds of things at the end of a long day. Selection bias matters. And if looking around this room doesn't reinforce that, then perhaps nothing will. Okay? All right. So my group was really focused on the return of results. And one quick clarification that I want to offer you is that we weren't focused on whether or not the return of results was a good thing, but rather whether or not the return of results was an effective recruitment tool, which is a bit more of a specific question. However, as I think you'll appreciate, as I kind of go down the list of what my group generated, you'll appreciate that there's an overlap between those two particular sets of questions. So in terms of talking about the return of results as an effective recruitment tool, I first had my team talk about a specific set of barriers to knowing whether or not that was a valid question in order to being able to effectively address that question. And they came up with 5 key barriers. The 5 barriers, which you'll appreciate have some overlap, focus on psychosocial barriers, ethical barriers, legal barriers, scientific integrity barriers, and resource/infrastructural barriers. So the group felt very strongly that these 5 elements in particular made it hard to know whether or not the return of results was an effective recruitment tool. And I think to a more limited extent, also whether these were effective retention tools, because we're not going to pretend that those two things are the same. So some of these barriers in particular that the group generated were focusing on different kinds of stakeholder groups. One stakeholder group that emerged very quickly from the discussion was the IRB. In terms of trying to re-identify individualized results that we're going to be returning to into participants, the IRB was cited as a recurring barrier to making that process either facile or smooth or intuitive. There were elements discussing the ethicality of giving back individualized research results, especially research results that do not yet or may not ever have a definitive, clear clinical utility. And then for even beyond that, there was some concern that there may be an ethical question around the disclosure process itself. How best to provide the information? Do we provide research results in the same way that we would disclose something actionable during our current observational clinical studies? Does that process need to be separate? Does it need to be bound by the same clinical guidelines, things of that nature? There were other barriers that were mentioned in terms of equity. And one element that I thought was really interesting was language. So in terms of trying to communicate the research results across multiple language groups, but additionally in terms of communicating it from translating our scientific information to being information that is appropriate and timely and relevant for a lay audience. So, for example, I sort of told a bad joke about, do we just give people unprocessed T2 star scans and call it a day, and just have them try to figure it out using Google/WebMD? I think the answer is probably no, but where is the line in terms of how we communicate these kinds of things? The group came up with a number of other really interesting barriers, like whether disclosing these results would unduly influence the cohort in terms of, say, future cognitive performance, whether there would be some kind of bias. And then right off the bat, just as soon as I asked the question, there was a clear, I think, curiosity about who would want the research results and how do we go about identifying them ahead of time and in real time. And so the last thing, I'm going to skip to the end of our session when I kind of asked the thought-provoking question about whether we should be paternalistic or not in terms of disclosing research results to individuals. So there was one person in the room who noted that many individuals in the Diane study have maybe at first indicated that they wanted their genetic information or they wanted their PET scan information, and once they got their PET scan information, if it was positive or if it was somehow concerning, then they were maybe not as happy about that. So to what extent do we trust that people know what they want? And how do we assess that accordingly? So from these 5 particular barriers, again, the psychosocial barriers, the ethical barriers, the legal ones, scientific integrity, and the resources infrastructure, I had the group also identify a set of solutions. And I was actually really impressed with the group solutions. So the first thing that came out of the group was that we need to talk to focus groups, and that we need to make sure that our questions and our presentation and any returned information is participant-centered, that it is participant-focused. So there was a moment when our group was debating the ethicality of returning results at all, and especially in the context of using it as a recruitment tool. So there were some in the audience, some in the group that felt that it was perhaps coercive. There were some in the group that thought it was iffy. And then there were some in the group that thought, that as long as there was relatively clear disclosure about what the results were and how they could be interpreted, that it was absolutely fine. And there was actually a really interesting comment from one of the participants that said, if we're going to invest all of these resources into developing results that we're going to be returning to individuals, that we translate them to make sure that they are clear and timely, then I should get something back. I should get something out of it. And that thing that I want out of it is for people to participate in my research study. So we talked a little bit about whether that was ethical, whether that was inducement, whether that was coercive. And the group, I think, fell kind of across the spectrum. And I think what we all agreed on is that there's a line there. Obviously, there was a clear call for more funding for this kind of thing, and that the funding should come from agencies like NIA and from advocacy organizations like the Cure Alzheimer's Fund and the Alzheimer's Association to help address these kinds of things and to help, I think, not just provide money, but help define where the money is best oriented. I also had the group identify what kinds of key scientific measures need to come out of this. And so the first question is that we need to figure out how many people are recruited from this particular, using this particular recruitment tool. How many people change their mind about participating in a study, one way or the other, as a result of being told that they would receive research results? We need to think a bit about attrition. Dr. Carrillo came up with, I think, a really insightful comment that said that we need to reach out to individuals who have declined to participate, individuals who have dropped out of a study, and tried to assess whether the return of results, the return of a specific set of results, would have changed their minds or moved their needles in some way, shape, or form. And wrapping up here, there were a couple of really great comments, but I do have to note that these comments came at the end, which I thought was interesting, of trying to identify successful cases of using return of results as a recruitment tool and reaching out to interdisciplinary teams. It seems that even in a place like this, we are still very siloed in how we frame some of these issues. And I just want to kind of encourage everybody to think a little bit more broadly. Another really insightful comment by Dr. Carrillo is that we have to recognize that we may not have all the expertise we need. So she cited a clear example of maybe speaking to some marketers about some of these things and kind of developing a set of recruitment metrics that are tied to the same kind of outcomes that marketers use, and recognizing that accrual into a clinical trial or an observational study is not the only measure that we need to care about when it comes to something like this. So the group finally identified funding, identifying a key set of measures and outcomes, and prioritizing the opinions of the people who matter, which is to say the prospective participants, as the most important action items moving forward. And that's what my group had to say. Hopefully I represented all of your thoughts well. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. So the last group we're going to hear the readout from would be the transparency group, and Joy Ballsbury is going to report it if she is coming. Yes, she is. Oh, and thanks to Kristen Stock, who was the scribe.
Okay, can y'all hear me pretty good? I know I talk loud anyway because I got a big mouth. All right, so I'd like to thank our scribe, the future Dr. Stock. I am sending up well wishes for you, and thank you for being diligent in your note-taking and being willing to come up with me and be embarrassed in front of everybody else to help me report out, because I believe that students should also be engaged in this process, so thank you for giving me a student. So thank you again for that. So in our group, we talked about transparency as it relates to health research. We had a collection of community members, healthcare providers, so physicians and nurses, as well as health sciences researchers in our small cohort. There were a total of 15 of us, and we started the conversation with talking about fear. And how does fear impact research? So one of our participants said, when I asked the question, how do we overcome fear? And to quote her, she said, educate. And I was like, tell us more. And she said, and this person was a physician, and she said, clinically, when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, we have to first define the topic. Fear comes not from knowing any better, not knowing what's available. Research needs to be explained in a group setting, and people will be more receptive. And it is important to educate with respect for dignity of the individual. African Americans do not want to be talked down to. And this particular physician is also African American. So she understands it both from the clinical setting. She's also a physician scientist, so she understands this as a scientist, and a woman of color. Then another participant said, fear is a learned experience. The unknown and not knowing what you're going to face. The unknown is the fear. Another participant said that fear is false evidence appearing real. So many of you all may have heard that. So it's just really thinking about it in a way, how we acknowledge where people are right now so that we can understand the dialogues that we need to have to increase education around research, to increase research literacy, and have these bidirectional and co-learning opportunities, because we won't change anything if we're living in fear. We also talked a little bit about fatalism and how fatalism can also impact our health and our wellness, and that for some, even in the room, it's been difficult to them to talk to someone or even know who to go to. So some of the suggestions that we had in our group was to say, talk to your physician, talk to your loved ones, and things like that. And anybody in the group, if I misspeak, please feel free to speak up. So the other thing that we talked about was whether or not, if we think in terms of educating research staff, what do we need to do to help researchers, to help their study participants overcome fear? And so a lot of things came up that we wanted to unpack, but we didn't have as much time as we probably needed. And so one of our participants said, we need to validate the root of the fear, so that people don't feel turned off or excluded. So when we think of the root of fear, it's if it's taught, and then we want to understand the why it's happening, that means that we really need to be ready to unpack some uncomfortable conversations as it relates to history, from their thoughts about medical research overall, systematic racism and systematic discrimination, issues around maybe their thoughts about the health institution that might be doing the research. Where I live in Rochester, Minnesota, Mayo is the biggest employer. So people have ideas about Mayo as well as an employer, as well as a health agency that also does research and provides education. So just acknowledging where all of these things come from. And so we did have a bit of a conversation about, and I'm using my buddy's computer, so thank you. So give me a second. So another participant said that to help people overcome their fear is try to walk the participants through the research process so that they may understand what they are signing up for, and start with lighter research first. And we put that in quotes, lighter research. And so when we started talking about that, we said, okay, what does that mean to you? So we talked about the fact that maybe starting with surveys, maybe starting with focus groups, taking the participants, if it is a clinical trial or a device trial or other things like that, actually walking them through every step that is going to happen. Not just saying, okay, we're going to get some biomarker data and we're going to draw some blood and we're going to do a lumbar puncture. Well, what does that mean to the participant? Is it going to hurt? Who else, has done this before? How can we make sure that their questions about each step in the research process are addressed? So we also talked about how we need to think about other communities that might be under-resourced when it comes to research, or even underrepresented in research. So we discussed a little bit of the work that Dr. Monica Parker and I did about 6 years ago with high-income earning African-American women and their perceptions of medical research. And what we found was that high-income earning women Black women were not even being asked to participate in research. And some of these researchers are in this room, in terms of, who could be involved in that particular study. And these were women that were members of the national body of the Links Incorporated, and they were not being asked. And these are judges, these are physicians, these are lawyers and teachers and domestic engineers who have not been engaged in the research process. So one of the things that someone said is that all women and men who want to participate should be asked to participate. And that we discovered in our study that many of them were not being asked, and so we had to find out cues to make sure that their healthcare providers or even giving them resources to learn more about opportunities to participate. So that's a call to action to you, for those of us in the room that are scientists, is making sure that we're not only thinking about community dwelling people, but we also think of folks within our own backyard that are also at risk for similar diseases as well. Because it goes beyond just socioeconomic status. Because we learned in that study that most of these women were still at risk or dying from the same diseases as our brothers and sisters. So we asked them, what do we need to do next? And someone said empowerment. And reminding the participants that they have the power. And that under-resourced and underrepresented groups sometimes means poor to many, but that we need to be reminded that the wealthy are also sometimes underrepresented as well. And sometimes we may miss these people and think only of people of color as being people that are in poor health or lack resources or be in poor financial status. And so we also talked about how do we provide opportunities for individuals to participate. And someone mentions that investigators at academic medical centers and research centers need to do a better job of disseminating the research opportunities, and that people of color are often looked at as objects. So stop looking at African Americans as a disease, but as people that might have a health concern. So we talked a little bit in that process when we unpacked that. We talked about how with some diseases, we'll say that person is diabetic, but that might be one thing that makes up the sum of who they are, but it's not the entirety of who they are. And the stigma that might relate in someone being labeled or classified by a term that they don't want to be classified with. So we talked about how using the terms, this person is living with the health concern. So they're living with Alzheimer's or dementia. They're living with diabetes. They're living with hypertension. So it's all in the language that we use, that we want to make sure that it takes into consideration the cultural landscapes of the communities that we work with, while we're also trying to reduce stigma. And so we talked about, in this same dialogue, about building research programs around minority communities. It needs to be full circled, and that we need to make sure that we give participants a voice in our research study design. When we asked about stakeholders, because we wanted to really talk about, we did take a social ecological approach to these questions, where we started with the individual, from the interpersonal, and then we asked a little bit about interpersonal, their families and their friends and their loved ones, as well as the community and the systems in which people live. So we asked them, well, who are our stakeholders? Who do we need to empower to have a voice throughout the research process? From identifying the opportunity all the way through dissemination. So one of the participants mentioned community advisory boards being a part of the research process from beginning to end. Some single center studies are usually observational. And so there was a talk about phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, how they're not always inclusive. But the big phase 3 trials are not only multi-center, but they are also almost always international. And so thinking about the complexity of those types of trial designs as well. But one thing that really stuck out to me was when someone said that we need to be a good neighbor. No matter where you are, you have to invest in the community before doing research. And they brought up something that made a lot of us laugh in the room. They were like, similar to AARP, talking to people well before they turn 50. Institutions must know that they have the opportunities here to invest in people and their health, and discovering the priorities in the process before trying to recruit them for research. Be honest, transparent, and committed to the community. And people need a relationship with you, and so we need to make sure that we explain the benefits. And all of us laughed because some of the people in the room or nowhere near 50. So, but we laughed, and I made the joke. I was like, yes, my husband is younger than me. And as soon as I started getting those AARP notifications at 39, he started teasing me. And we won't say how long ago that was. So, yes, so we talked a little bit about that. We also talked about the risk to the individual participant and the risk to the community and and the system that people belong to. And it all went back to education, to allowing participants and their communities the opportunities to share what they are doing with the people that are following them, that are in their space. And then someone mentioned that it is full circle and it impacts their engagement and willingness to participate. So making sure that when we enroll participants, that we allow them the opportunity to share what they're doing with their loved ones, with their community, and saying to them that this is not a secret, feel free to share. And if someone has questions, making sure that they have the opportunity to have their questions answered by the study team. Okay. So bear with me a second. Again, thank you for letting me use your computer. And so a lot of things were, we talked about knowing the outcomes of the narrative, not knowing the outcomes of the narrative, and that we need to make sure that we are more representative in our study designs. And we also talked a lot about how to engage in the research process in a way that takes into consideration the participant and the fear that they might experience or they might be aware of in terms of those around them, in terms of the history of the research process. And I am going to shut up so that we can move forward with our agenda. Thank you.
Well, this has been a marvelous day. I know it's been a long day, but it has been really remarkable in terms of the quality and the breadth of the presentations and with the questions from the attendees. And I know a lot has gone on outside of the formal presentations in terms of discussions and talking about networking and future collaborations. So we have accomplished a lot today. One thing we reiterated is Alzheimer's disease and related dementias are very, very complicated, and there are many factors that can contribute to the development of these conditions, and they're not all simply biologic or genetic, but they involve a number of socioeconomic factors and life course factors, and so it's going to take a while before we fully understand the disease. It's also going to take a while before we fully can be inclusive of all people who we need to study to really understand the broad impact of Alzheimer's disease across all racial and ethnic groups. We haven't accomplished everything today by far, but with the talent and the creativity and the motivation of our speakers and indeed of all of you, I believe that we someday soon will look back on today and say, here's where it all started, began here. And so with that, I want to thank you for being here and for everyone who is being here. In a way, this is a historic beginning, and I appreciate everyone's involvement. So thank you very much and safe travels.